There are places in every great story where the world feels older than the words used to describe it. Sinnoh carries that weight quietly, tucked beneath its mountain passes and reflected in the still surfaces of its lakes. It is a region built on the idea that some things existed long before anyone thought to name them. Every cave and ruin in this place holds a question that the game never quite answers aloud. Settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokemon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. Sinnoh was designed around the concept of myth as geography. The mountains, the lakes, and the underground caverns were not simply landscapes to move through. They were embodiments of ideas, physical expressions of stories that the region's inhabitants had carried for generations. Mount Coronet stood at the center of everything, not just as a navigational landmark, but as a living monument to the belief that the world itself had a beginning, and that beginning happened here. The designers of the region drew from Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands. Hokkaido carries a particular stillness that is different from the rest of the country. Its winters are long and its landscapes feel ancient in a way that resists easy description. That quality translated directly into Sinnoh's atmosphere, the cold roots, the heavy snowfall along certain paths, and the sense that civilization had only recently begun to stake its claim against something much older all came from that same source. Players who entered Sinnoh for the first time often described a feeling that was different from any previous region. It was not just the weather or the new designs. It was something in the pacing of discovery, the way information came slowly and always felt connected to something deeper, waiting just out of reach. Snow Point City sat at the northern edge of the region and functioned as more than a waypoint toward a gym. Its location near the coast of what felt like an endless frozen sea gave it a quality of solitude that few other towns in the series had ever achieved. The buildings were low and compact, the kind of architecture that suggests people who have learned to take up as little space as possible in the face of something enormous. The temple at the edge of the city was sealed to most visitors. Its existence was known, but its interior was restricted, accessible only to those who had already proven themselves across the entire region. This deliberate withholding was an unusual design choice. Most legendary encounters in previous games were placed at the natural endpoint of the story, but here the temple sat in plain view, close enough to examine from outside, far away enough in every meaningful sense that it might as well have been at the other end of the world. Inside that temple waited Regigigas, a being whose mythology placed it not just within Sinnoh, but at the very foundation of the physical world. According to the legends preserved in the region's lore, this creature had once moved the continents themselves, pulling the landmasses of the world into the positions they currently hold. The idea that such a thing could exist in a sealed room in a snowy city, sleeping, waiting, was one of Sinnoh's quieter astonishments. The design of Regigigas reflected this sense of ancient labor. Its body was vast and pale, marked with subtle moss-like patterns that suggested something which had not moved in a very long time. Its eyes were small and distant. When players finally stood before it, the encounter felt less like a battle and more like an interruption of something that had been ongoing for an incomprehensible span of time. The mechanics reinforced this quality, as the creature's ability left it weakened at the start of any engagement, as though waking from something deep required its own form of recovery. The lakes of Sinnoh were arranged with a precision that felt deliberate even on first inspection. Lake Verity, Lake Valor, and Lake Acuity formed a triangle across the region, each one home to a small island at its center, and each island home to a cavern where something waited. The symmetry of this arrangement was not accidental. It reflected the way the game conceived of balance as a structural principle rather than simply a theme. The beings that lived within those caverns were called the Lake Guardians. Each one embodied a concept that the region treated as fundamental. One governed knowledge, one governed emotion, and one governed willpower. Together, they were said to have fashioned the human spirit itself from a fragment of a being far greater than any of them. This origin story placed them in an unusual position within Pokémon mythology. They were not creators in the way that the divine Pokémon of the region was understood to be a creator. They were craftspeople, fashioners of something smaller and more intimate than a universe. Mesprit was the one associated with emotion. Its design was soft and pale, with a long, flowing tail and an expression that seemed permanently settled somewhere between serenity and melancholy. Players who encountered Mesprit discovered that it did not stay still. After its initial appearance in the cavern, it departed and began to wander the region. Tracking it required patience and a certain willingness to simply keep moving without any guarantee that the search would end quickly. This roaming quality was not accidental. A being that embodied emotion would naturally resist confinement. It moved through the region the way feelings do, appearing unexpectedly, vanishing before a proper encounter could be established, requiring the pursuer to keep following without certainty. Players often described finding Mesprit as one of their more memorable moments in the game, not because the battle itself was remarkable, but because the chase had made the arrival feel earned. A Zelf sat in the cavern beneath Lake Valor and embodied willpower. Its coloring was different from its counterparts, a stronger blue, more alert in its posture. Unlike Mesprit, Azelf remained in its cavern and could be challenged directly. This distinction between the roaming and the stationary felt meaningful when considered alongside what each being represented. Willpower, the stories suggested, was the quality that held its ground. Uxie was the third and governed knowledge. Its cave beneath Lake Acuity was the northernmost of the three, sitting in the coldest and most remote part of the region. Uxie was known in Sinnoh lore as the being that gave humanity the capacity to learn and understand, but it had paid a price for that gift. Its eyes were always closed. The legend held that anyone who met its gaze would lose all memory. This detail was one of Sinnoh's more quietly haunting pieces of mythology. A creature that could strip a person of everything they had ever learned simply by looking at them carried a kind of irony that felt deliberately designed. The guardian of knowledge was also the eraser of it. That contradiction was never explicitly addressed in the games, which made it feel more resonant rather than less. Some things are simply held as true in Sinnoh without requiring explanation. The distortion world was something the games had never attempted before. Most legendary encounters took place in accessible locations, caves or towers or peaks that existed within the same physical logic as the rest of the game. Giratina's realm did not follow that logic. It was a space where gravity had no consistent direction, where platforms floated in configurations that had no parallel in the natural world, and where the usual rules of movement were replaced by something that required constant reorientation. Players who entered this space often described a feeling of deliberate disorientation. The visual design was striking, but difficult to parse quickly. The usual shorthand for understanding a space, ground is below, sky is above, did not apply. Objects hung in configurations that made sense only once you stopped applying normal spatial assumptions and allowed the world to teach its own rules. Giratina itself had two forms, which made it unusual even among the Sinnoh legendaries. In most of the games, it appeared in a form that looked compressed, restrained, as though some quality of its true nature had been folded inward. Within the distortion world, it assumed its original appearance, larger and more elaborate, with appendages that spread outward like something no longer holding itself in. The difference between its forms carried a meaning that was never spelled out, but felt present nonetheless. In the world that was built for it, it could be what it actually was. Elsewhere, it wore something smaller. The mythology of Giratina described it as having been banished to the distortion world for violence. The specifics of that transgression were never given. What remained was the shape of a story familiar from many traditions, a powerful being cast out for reasons that are referenced but not explained in full, left to inhabit a realm that was its prison and its domain simultaneously. The design team behind the Sinnoh Legendaries built a relationship between three beings that was more structurally complete than any the series had previously attempted. Dialga, who governed time, and Palkia, who governed space, were the twin pillars upon which physical reality rested. Giratina, associated with antimatter and with the forces of opposition and entropy, completed the triad from a position of exclusion. Dialga's design read as mechanical and ancient at once. Its blue and silver coloring, combined with the diamond-shaped formations on its chest, suggested something that had been constructed rather than grown, but the organic lines of its body contradicted that reading. It was the kind of design that rewarded attention. The more closely examined, the more details emerged that complicated simple categorization. Palkia carried a similar quality in different visual language. Its pearl-colored body and the discs embedded in its shoulders gave it a cosmic quality that fit its association with space. Its overall silhouette was slightly more open than Dialga's, as though the creature itself occupied a larger volume than its physical dimensions might suggest. Both creatures appeared on legendary items from Sinnoh's ancient history. Stone carvings discovered in ruins showed these two beings in conflict, an image that was central to one of the most climactic sequences in the games. The idea that ancient peoples had witnessed or imagined a battle between the embodiments of time and space and recorded it in stone was one of the details that gave Sinnoh its particular sense of scale. The underground was a system that existed beneath the entire surface of the region and could be accessed from almost any point through the use of an explorer kit. This subterranean network was extensive in a way that rewarded exploration. Players could dig into the walls to find spheres, fossils, and shards. They could construct secret bases in hollowed-out alcoves and decorate them with items found in the same underground spaces. The existence of this entire parallel geography beneath the region players already knew added a sense of depth that was partly literal. Moving through the underground, while simultaneously knowing that the same world existed above, was a particular quality of Sinnoh that no region before it had attempted. The region had layers in a way that matched its thematic concerns with history and hidden things. Grand Underground, as it was expanded in later versions of the Sinnoh games, revealed even more of what lay beneath the surface. Pokémon hid in specific biomes within these subterranean spaces, and the variety of environments found underground did not always match what might be expected based on the surface geography above. There were areas of lush vegetation deep beneath tundra. There were volcanic formations beneath forests. The underground seemed to follow its own logic, shaped by pressures and histories that the surface did not reflect. Fossil Pokémon could be revived from specimens found in these underground digs. The connection between digging and discovery was one the games reinforced at multiple levels, as though the act of excavating the earth was always the appropriate method for finding something that had been present longer than you had. Cynthia was the champion of Sinnoh and occupied that role with a quality that distinguished her from the champions that had preceded her in the series. Her interest in the mythology of the region was genuine and her knowledge was deep. She appeared at key moments in the story, not simply as a figure of authority or as a milestone on the path to the League, but as someone who understood what was happening in a way that the player's character was still working toward. Her team reflected careful consideration. The presence of Garchomp, a dragon and ground type, at the center of her strategy, gave players an encounter that was widely discussed for its difficulty. Garchomp's combination of speed and power made it a formidable opponent, and Cynthia's other selections supported it in ways that punished unprepared challengers. The battle against her was remembered by many players as the most demanding champion encounter the series had offered at that point. But the character herself carried qualities beyond her battle team. Her interest in mythology, her consistent appearance throughout the story as a source of context rather than instruction, and the way she treated the player's character as someone genuinely involved in events of importance all contributed to a presence that felt more fully realized than the role might have required. Her grandmother ran a small house of rest in Celestic Town, and within that town the oldest ruins in Sinnoh could be found. The murals preserved there depicted images of ancient Pokémon that the modern region had not seen in the wild. That connection, the champion's family living in the town where the deepest history of the region was preserved, suggested a continuity between personal story and regional mythology that felt intentional. Celestic Town itself was one of the quieter revelations of the region. It was small, without the busy infrastructure of larger cities, and it felt as though time had agreed to slow down in the area around it. The ruins at its center were protected behind a rockfall that needed to be cleared before full access was possible. This small obstacle functioned as a gate, suggesting that what lay beyond was not meant to be encountered casually. The interior of the ruins held paintings that depicted figures later confirmed to be Dialga and Palkia, shown in a confrontation that echoed the one recorded in other stone carvings that scattered across the region. That the same event had been depicted in multiple places by multiple groups of ancient people gave the impression that it had actually happened. The mythology was not simply story. It carried the texture of recorded history. Team Galactic's interest in Celestic Town was connected to this. Their leaders sought to use the myths as a blueprint to recreate or summon the conditions under which the universe might be remade. The ruins were not simply cultural heritage. They were operational documents for a plan of cosmic ambition. This reframing of archaeological interest as ideological resource was one of the details that gave the villainous organization a quality distinct from those that had come before. The townspeople of Celestic spoke about the ancient events with a familiarity that suggested ongoing relationship rather than historical awareness. They did not treat the stories as remote. They lived alongside them. This quality extended throughout much of Sinnoh's population. The myths were present in daily life in a way that shaped how people understood their own place in the world. Spiritomb was obtained through a method unlike any other Pokémon in the game. Players needed to interact with a specific stone in a specific location and then speak with a certain number of other players through the Underground's communication system. Only after those interactions were complete would the creature emerge from the stone to be encountered. This social requirement for a single-player encounter was unusual. It suggested that the creature's release required more than individual effort. Something about Spiritomb's nature demanded that the person seeking it had demonstrated connection to others before it would show itself. The design reinforced this quality. Spiritomb was formed from 108 spirits, bound together into a single entity by the crack in a stone called the Odd Keystone. Its typing was Ghost and Dark, a combination that at the time of its introduction had no weaknesses under the existing type chart. This quirk of the type system gave it a defensive quality that matched the sense of something that had endured through forces greater than individual effort. The number 108 carried significance in certain Japanese spiritual traditions, where it represented the number of earthly desires or troubles that needed to be confronted. Whether this numerical choice was deliberate or coincidental, it gave Spiritomb a context that extended beyond the game's explicit mythology into something older and more broadly resonant. Its Pokédex entries spoke of it having once been sealed away for its misdeeds. The details of those misdeeds were not given, only the consequence remained: the binding of many spirits into one form, contained within a stone, waiting in a specific location for someone to arrive who had done the necessary work to meet it. The evolution of Budo into Roselia and then Roserade followed a pattern of gradual refinement that reflected Sinnoh's approach to connecting generations. Roserade's design took the elegant floral quality of Roselia and elevated it into something that felt ceremonial. The bouquets it carried in each hand, one toxin-laden white roses, one equally dangerous red roses, functioned as both decoration and weapon. This combination of beauty and danger was handled with a subtlety that gave the final design a quality the earlier forms had gestured toward but not fully achieved. Sinnoh introduced a significant number of evolutions for Pokémon from previous generations. The decision to expand on creatures that players already knew was received with mixed reactions at the time. Some felt that it disrupted the internal logic of earlier regions, which had presented their rosters as complete. Others recognized it as a way of deepening the sense that the world was larger than any single game had been able to show. Togekiss emerged from Togetic through the use of a shiny stone. The creature had existed in the series since the second generation, but its final form gave it a presence that its earlier stages had not fully suggested. Its round, dove-like silhouette became iconic quickly. Its typing as a fairy in later interpretations, though fairy did not exist as a category when it was introduced, fit so naturally that the retroactive reclassification felt less like a correction and more like a confirmation of something that had always been the case. Electivire and Magmortar expanded on Electabuzz and Magmar in directions that made the evolutionary lines feel complete in a way they had not before. Both creatures gained a sense of physical mass and elemental intensity that matched their types more fully. The decision to use new evolutionary stones and trade mechanics for several of these additions gave the process of obtaining them a weight that reflected the significance of the transformations themselves. Garchomp's presence in the region extended beyond its role in Cynthia's team. It was findable in the wild, but only in one of the most remote locations in the game, a route accessible only to players who had made significant progress. The creature's rarity in the wild matched the effort required to reach it. Finding one felt like a discovery rather than a routine encounter. Its design balanced dragon aesthetics with something more akin to a large predatory fish. The fins, the streamlined shape, the speed that the design seemed to be moving, even while standing still. The hammerhead quality of its head gave it a profile distinct from most other dragon types in the series. Its pseudo-legendary classification placed it in the same tier as creatures from previous generations that had defined their region's upper echelons, but its visual language was entirely its own. The competitive history of Garchomp was extensive. Its combination of speed, attack, and reliable coverage moved it through various tiers of play across many generations of the series. It was a creature that competitive players returned to repeatedly, finding new uses as the metagame shifted around it. The fact that it appeared in a champion's team and also became a foundational, competitive Pokémon demonstrated that the design had achieved something genuinely multidimensional. In the Sinnoh mythology, no specific legendary status was attributed to Garchomp. It was a creature of the region's physical world rather than its cosmic architecture, but its prominence in competitive play and its association with the champion gave it a cultural weight within the franchise that operated somewhat independently of any in-game story. Riolu and its evolution. Lucario arrived in Sinnoh as creatures whose design drew from martial arts, traditions, and also from the concept of aura, a life force radiating from all living things that could be perceived and shaped by those with sufficient training. This concept was introduced explicitly in a film that preceded the game's release and established Lucario as a character before it became widely available as a Pokemon players could add to their own teams. The aura concept gave Lucario a kind of interiority that most designs did not explicitly claim. It was not simply a powerful fighter, it was a perceiver, a being that understood the world through a sense that other creatures and humans did not naturally possess. This quality made the Lucario character in the film function as something close to a protagonist, and the design was strong enough to carry that role. Riolu could only be obtained through a specific egg given at a particular point in the story. This limited availability early in the game, combined with the longer than usual hatching time, gave the acquisition of a Riolu a quality of anticipation that standard encounters did not create. Players who wanted one had to commit before the egg hatched, carrying it through routes and battles without knowing exactly when it would open. The arrival, when it came, felt specific to each player's experience in a way that random encounters in grass did not. Lucario's steel and fighting typing gave it a defensive profile that matched its elegant design. It resisted many common attack types while hitting back with both physical and special options depending on what a player needed from it. This versatility, combined with strong base stats and a design that had already been established as significant before the games launched, made it one of the most recognized Pokemon introduced in the 4th generation. The ruins at the bottom of Route 209, known as the Lost Tower, carried a particular atmosphere. It was a tall structure on a route that felt quieter than most, with trainers who spoke about their deceased Pokemon rather than the ambitions or rivalries that filled most trainer dialogue. The tower was a memorial, and the game did not minimize that. Players ascending the tower would encounter wild Pokemon appropriate to the tone of the place. The final floor held 2 elderly women who offered rewards for reaching the top, a quiet acknowledgement that the act of climbing a memorial had its own significance beyond combat. The entire structure functioned as a small lesson in the game's relationship with loss, rendered without drama or extended narrative, present simply as a place that existed and could be visited. Sinnoh held several locations like this, places that asked something of a player's attention without demanding it. The town of Hearthome was associated with Pokemon contests and with a church-like building whose interior held stained glass and quiet music. The building had no mechanical function in the main story, but players who entered it found themselves in a space that seemed designed to encourage rest. Amity Square in Hearthome allowed certain Pokemon to walk alongside the player outside of battle. The qualification for which Pokemon could enter, described in the game as Pokemon that seemed cute, was a deliberately imprecise category that prompted discussion. The space itself was gentle, designed for wandering rather than purpose, and the Pokemon that accompanied players through it moved according to their own rhythms, rather than matching the player's pace exactly. Pastoria City's Great Marsh was Sinnoh's Safari Zone equivalent, a wide wetland area where certain Pokemon could only be found after completing the day's daily draw, which determined which rare species were present on any given visit. This randomization meant that players seeking specific creatures might need to return multiple times, a mechanical choice that reflected the actual quality of searching for animals in a marshland. You do not always find what you came looking for. You return, the marsh is still there. The Pokemon available in the Great Marsh included several that could not be found anywhere else in the region. Carnivine, a grass type based on carnivorous plants, appeared there as one of its rare daily offerings. Its presence in a wetland environment fit with the real-world distribution of many carnivorous plant species, which often grow in nutrient-poor boggy areas where consuming insects supplements what the soil cannot provide. The marsh's atmosphere was distinct from the rest of the region. The observation decks at the entrance allowed players to use binoculars to see which Pokemon were present before entering, a preview system that made the daily visits feel less like random luck and more like planning followed by execution. This small element of agency within a system that was largely randomized gave players a sense of participation in the search rather than simply submission to it. Wooper and its evolution Quagsire had long been available in the series, but the Great Marsh offered one of Sinnoh's clearest examples of ecological placement, a creature associated with water and mud in an environment that matched it exactly. These small consistencies throughout the region contributed to the sense that Sinnoh had been built with attention to the relationship between creatures and their environments, rather than simply distributing Pokémon for mechanical variety. Hardhome's Contest Hall was one of the most fully developed contest venues in the series. The mechanics of Pokémon contests, where players trained and presented their Pokémon for aesthetic and performance qualities rather than combat effectiveness, had existed since the third generation but received significant expansion in Sinnoh. New categories, new berry-based preparation methods, and the addition of a super contest mode that incorporated a rhythm element gave the system more depth than it had previously held. The appeal of contests within the narrative of Sinnoh was connected to the character of Fantina, the Hardhome gym leader. She was a performer as well as a battler, her gym decorated with the aesthetic language of a contest hall and her battle style theatrical in a way that suited her ghost-type team. The overlap between contest culture and gym culture in her characterization suggested that the game understood these two systems as expressions of a similar underlying interest in the relationship between Pokémon and beauty. Contest conditions, the metrics of coolness, beauty, cuteness, smartness, and toughness that determined how a Pokémon performed, were raised through poffins, food made from berries, through a minigame that involved stirring batter at the right pace. Berries grew at different speeds and could be planted in soft soil found throughout the region. This agricultural element of Sinnoh, the cultivation of berries over real time, gave the game a quality of ongoing relationship with the region that persisted between sessions. Players who engaged deeply with contests found that preparing a Pokémon for the Super Contest Master rank required a commitment of time and attention comparable to competitive battle training. The two systems were parallel in their demands while being entirely different in their goals. Sinnoh was unusual in how fully it supported both. The mythology of the creation trio, as the legendary beings of Sinnoh were often grouped, included a story preserved in a book found in the Canalave Library. The book described a time before time when everything was chaos and the emergence of a single egg from that formlessness. What hatched from that egg became the source from which all else followed. The Canalave Library itself was one of the region's quieter treasures. Its books contained fragments of Sinnoh's histories and legends, available to any player who paused long enough to read them. These texts were written with genuine care. They did not summarize mythology in simple terms, but preserved the cadence of oral tradition, the way stories told across generations accumulate texture and ambiguity. One of the books in the library described a time when Pokémon and humans lived together so closely that the distinction between them was unclear. It spoke of eating from the same plate, sleeping under the same roof, a relationship of mutual dependence that predated the formal institutions of the Pokémon League. This historical backstory, present only as a book on a shelf in a library that players could pass through without stopping, gave Sinnoh a sense of deep time that no other region had quite achieved. Another text described a man who sought to understand the world by converting everything he could perceive into numbers. He filled his house with equations and found himself unable to stop, eventually quantifying his own existence until there was nothing left of him but mathematics. This story, fragmentary and strange, seemed to have no direct connection to the main plot. It existed simply as a piece of Sinnoh's inner life, evidence of a world that thought about things. Iron Island was an isolated location, accessible by ship from Canalave City. The island itself had once been a mining site, and the evidence of that industrial past was visible in the infrastructure that remained. It was also the training ground for a trainer named Riley, a calm and contemplative figure who walked the island's caverns with a Lucario at his side. Riley was not a major character in the story's main arc. He appeared at Iron Island, accompanied players through part of it, and offered a Riolu egg at the end of that journey. But the quality of his presence was distinct. He spoke about Aura with quiet certainty and moved through the industrial ruins with a serenity that suggested he had been coming here for a long time. The connection between an aura-sensitive trainer and a place defined by its geological history felt appropriate in a region where the ground itself was understood to hold memories. The steel types available in the caverns of Iron Island fit the aesthetic of the location. Steelix moved through the rock formations below. Graveler occupied the upper levels. The place felt like a working ecology built around the materials the miners had once come to extract. The minerals and metals that had drawn human industry had also shaped the creatures that lived there, and now that the industry was gone, the creatures remained. Riley's philosophical quietness was a counterpoint to the urgency that much of Sinnoh's story generated through its Team Galactic conflict. He was someone who had found something to do with his life that was not defined by conflict or ambition. That quality, rare in the cast of characters players encountered, made him memorable in proportion to his limited time on screen. The Battle Tower in the Battle Frontier of the Sinnoh games represented a system of competitive challenges that extended well beyond the story's completion. The frontier brain associated with the tower was Palmer, who turned out to be the father of one of the game's major rival characters. This family connection, revealed quietly through NPC dialogue and the player's own observations, added a layer of personal story to what might otherwise have been a purely mechanical challenge. The Battle Frontier as a whole was designed to test players who had already completed the main story and found themselves wanting more. Each facility offered a different format, requiring different skills and different approaches to team construction. The arcade, the factory, the hall, the castle, and the tower each had their own rules and their own frontier brain waiting at the end of a sufficient win streak. Players who engaged with the frontier often spoke of it as a different kind of game nested within the familiar one. Its challenges stripped away the resources that the main adventure provided in abundance and required a different kind of thinking. Rental teams, random element, battle points, the entire system was built around the idea that the most demanding test of a player's understanding was one where many of the usual advantages had been removed. The design philosophy of the Battle Frontier reflected Sinnoh's broader willingness to create spaces that rewarded deep engagement rather than simply marking progress. The region was full of optional content that assumed the player had both the time and the interest to find it. That assumption treated the player as someone who was genuinely invested rather than simply moving through a sequence of required encounters. Floroma Town occupied a small valley where flowers grew in such abundance that the site was striking before any other detail of the place could be assessed. The town had no gym and no significant story function beyond serving as a waypoint toward other locations. But it existed as a thing in itself, a place defined by its quality rather than its purpose. The meadow behind the town expanded the floral atmosphere and also served as the location for a honey tree encounter, though the trees themselves were distributed throughout the region. Honey could be applied to marked trees, and after sufficient time had passed, a Pokémon would be found waiting there. The species that appeared were different from those available elsewhere, and included creatures not easily found by other methods. The honey tree system was one of Sinnoh's clearest examples of a mechanic that operated on real time rather than in-game time. Players needed to wait actual hours between applying honey and returning to find a result. This requirement meant that the most engaged interactions with the system happened across days rather than within a single play session. The tree became a reason to return, a small appointment with a part of the game that persisted between other activities. Munchlax was among the possible encounters on honey trees, and its rarity was significant. The creature had been introduced through events and promotions before the fourth generation games were released, making it one of the first Sinnoh Pokémon players encountered without being able to obtain it through normal gameplay. When it finally became available through the Honey Tree system, its rarity within that system maintained the sense that finding one required a combination of patience and fortune that the design had deliberately calibrated. Galactic headquarters in Veilstone City was a large structure in a city defined by meteorites and a small department store. The meteorites scattered through the city were objects of scientific interest rather than mythological significance, which gave Veilstone a slightly different quality from Sinnoh's more myth-saturated locations. The city felt modern in a way that most of the region did not. Team Galactic's presence in Veilstone made sense within the game's construction of the organization as one that engaged seriously with technology and manipulation of natural forces. Their building was a working facility, not a dramatic lair or an ancient ruin. Players who infiltrated it encountered the ordinary infrastructure of a criminal enterprise, storage rooms, security systems, personnel with regular duties. The commander characters within Team Galactic had individual personalities that distinguished them from the generic grunt ranks below. Mars was impulsive, Jupiter was cold, Saturn had a quality of ambivalence that surfaced in certain late-game interactions. These distinctions gave the organization a sense of internal complexity that matched the complexity of its goals. The leader, Cyrus, was one of the more developed antagonist characters the series had offered. His motivation was not the acquisition of power or the pursuit of revenge. It was the elimination of what he called the incomplete and flawed nature of the universe, which he attributed to the existence of spirit and emotion. He wanted to create a new world from which these qualities had been removed. The systematic, impersonal nature of this goal gave him a chill that more emotionally transparent antagonists did not carry. The mythology connected to Arceus was handled with a restraint that matched the scale of what was being described. The being said to have created the universe did not appear through the main story in the original games. It was accessible only through an event item that was distributed through limited time promotions, which meant that many players completed the entire Sinnoh story without ever encountering the creature that sat at the apex of the region's cosmology. This absence from the standard experience gave Arceus a quality of rumor for many players. They knew it existed from Pokédex entries and from the mythology preserved in the library books, but it was not confirmed by direct encounter in the way that other legendaries were. It existed as something that the world of Sinnoh described, but that the player's world could not always reach. The Hall of Origin, the location where Arceus could be encountered through the event item, was accessible through Spearpillar, the same location where the climactic confrontation with Team Galactic's plans unfolded. The geographical overlap between the site of the game's major crisis and the site of the optional divine encounter was not incidental. Both events used the same location because both events touched the same category of existence, the edge of what the region's world could hold. Arceus's design was abstract compared to the other Sinnoh legendaries. Its body was white and luminous, its shape simultaneously suggesting a horse, a deer, and something that resisted animal categorization entirely. The ring around its torso, called the runic ring in some descriptions, held a plate that determined which type the creature embodied. This changeability, the ability to become any type depending on what was attached to it, was a mechanical expression of the idea that the creator of everything could not be constrained to a single aspect of creation. The Pokemon association with Sinnoh's Shaymin was connected to natural cycles and the restoration of damaged landscapes. Shaymin's standard form was small and gentle, a hedgehog-like creature carrying a white flower on its head. The flower bloomed or wilted based on the presence of clean air, a detail that the Pokédex entries developed into a quality of environmental sensitivity. A specific item obtained through events could transform Shaymin into its sky form, a dramatic change in silhouette and typing. The creature became a flying type, as well as grass, its body elongating and taking on a canine quality that suggested speed rather than the settled calm of its ground form. This transformation was temporary, reverting to the standard form under certain conditions, which gave the sky form a quality of situational expression rather than permanent change. Grisidea flowers, connected to Shaymin in the game's mythology, appeared in various parts of the Sinnoh region as decoration and as items. The flower was used in ceremonies of gratitude, and this cultural detail connected the creature's presence to an ongoing practice within the region rather than treating it as a purely wild phenomenon. People in Sinnoh knew about Shaymin not simply as a rare Pokemon, but as a creature associated with a specific human tradition. The Pokédex entries for Shaymin described its ability to instantly purify any place it landed, absorbing toxins from the environment and releasing the accumulated material as a floral fragrance. This capacity placed it within a category of Pokémon whose presence actively shaped the world around them, rather than simply inhabiting it. Sinnoh was full of such creatures, beings that did not simply live in an environment, but participated in its ongoing maintenance. Darkrai was associated with nightmares, and could be found only under conditions that, in the original games, required an event item called the Member Card, which unlocked access to the Harbor Inn in Canalave City. Players who entered the inn under these conditions found themselves transported to New Moon Island, a small and desolate place where Darkrai waited. The connection between Darkrai and the Harbor City was developed in supplementary material and suggested through NPC dialogue. Stories circulated in Canalave about people who had fallen into deep and unending nightmares. Some of these were attributed to encounters with Darkrai, though the creature was understood by those who knew it best as not malicious, but simply unable to control the effect its presence had on others. This moral ambiguity in Darkrai's characterization was one of its more thoughtful qualities. A creature that caused nightmares, not from intent, but from its own nature, faced a particular kind of isolation. The films and supplementary media explored this theme in ways the games only touched on, but the games established the foundation through their environmental design, New Moon Island as a place of desolation, separated from the inhabited world, appropriate for a being that could not safely exist near others. Its design carried the visual language of darkness without the theatrical aggression that might have been expected. The torn appearance of its lower body suggested something caught between solid and insubstantial. The white growth around its neck created a contrast that the rest of the design's darkness made starker. It was a creature that looked like something that had learned to be still because stillness was safer. The relationship between the game's fire, water, and grass starter Pokemon and the mythological frameworks of Sinnoh was less explicit than in some other regions, but present nonetheless. Turtwig, Chimchar, and Piplup each followed developmental arcs through 2 evolutions, and their final forms carried a weight of presence that matched the region's narrative seriousness. Torterra, the grass and ground type final evolution of Turtwig, was described in its Pokédex entries as large enough for small Pokémon to live on its back, treating it as a mobile ecosystem. The image of a Pokémon carrying a miniature forest on its shell connected to traditions of world-carrying animals from various mythological systems. A turtle supporting an entire world on its back being a concept found in multiple cultures. The design walked up to this imagery without making it entirely explicit. Infernape drew from traditions of the fire monkey in ways that were clear in its design and mythology. Its flame-crowned head and quick, martial bearing connected it to figures in Chinese and Japanese mythology, while being transformed into something original through the specifics of its design. Its competitive profile, a mixed attacker with high speed, made it one of the most discussed starters from a team-building perspective in the generations following its introduction. Empoleon was the only starter to receive a water and steel typing, a combination that gave it a defensive resilience unusual among starter final evolutions. Its penguin design, rendered in regal and armored terms that connected to naval and imperial imagery, was distinctive enough that it maintained a strong following among players who had chosen Piplup at the beginning of their Sinnoh journey. The lore of the Unown had begun in the second generation, but Sinnoh deepened it through the Siliceon ruins. The ancient alphabet-like Pokémon were found within the ruins in quantities that suggested collective presence rather than individual occurrence. The cave system containing them was decorated with their forms in arrangements that resembled texts, though no definitive translation was ever officially provided. Players who caught all 28 forms of Unown, including the question mark and exclamation forms, activated an event within the ruins that offered special items. This completionist requirement tied the full understanding of the ruins to the effort of collection, a mechanical expression of the idea that some knowledge came only through dedicated accumulation. The Unown's origins as within the broader mythology of Sinnoh were never fully clarified. Their alphabet-like nature raised questions about whether they predated human language or had emerged from it, whether they were creatures that had developed independently or expressions of something the region's ancient peoples had created. These questions remained open, which was consistent with Sinnoh's approach to its own deepest mysteries. The ruin maniac who spent years digging deeper into the Siliceon ruins as players caught more Unown was a character whose single-minded devotion to his work functioned as a small echo of the game's larger themes. He was not looking for treasure or power. He was looking to go deeper. The tunnel he was digging led nowhere specified. The process was the point. The routes connecting Sinnoh's cities often carried details that rewarded slow movement through them. Route 210, crossing the foggy area near Celestic Town, used the defog move to clear visibility in a way that changed the navigational quality of the path without blocking progress entirely. The fog was not an obstacle but an atmosphere, something that the world contained and that could be addressed without removing it entirely. Route 212, leading toward Pastoria City, passed through rain on its southern section, regardless of weather conditions elsewhere. This localized rainfall gave that stretch of road a persistent quality, as though the geography of that particular valley had made a decision about what kind of place it wanted to be. Players moving through it encountered water-type Pokémon in the grass and could use the Pokétch's rain detection app to track conditions. The cycling road connecting Eterna City to Oraberg offered an elevated perspective on the landscape below. The narrow path and the speed required to traverse it efficiently gave cycling in Sinnoh a quality distinct from other regions where the bike was primarily a tool for movement. The cycling road was a destination as well as a route. Pokémon Mansion outside Hardham, a large private estate with gardens and its own internal staff, introduced the Trophy Garden, a location where the owner's daily additions of specific Pokémon to the space meant that creatures not normally found in Sinnoh could be encountered there on rotation. The mansion's owner spoke with a combination of genuine enthusiasm for rare Pokémon and complete unawareness of how his circumstances differed from those of ordinary trainers. This character detail added a layer of gentle comedy to a location that otherwise functioned as useful late-game content. The Sinnoh Pokédex at the time of the game's original release was smaller than the national dex and organized in a way that reflected the regional story. The local numbering placed Dialga or Palkia, depending on the version, at the high end of the local sequence, making these legendaries visible as endpoints in a way that encouraged players to understand their significance before reaching them. The national dex, unlocked after completing the local dex, opened access to hundreds of additional creatures and emphasized that Sinnoh was one region among several rather than the whole of the world. The Pokemon Ranger games and other spin-offs set in or around Sinnoh expanded the region's geography in directions the main games only suggested. Areas referenced in NPC dialogue, but not visitable in the main titles, appeared in these adjacent works, giving dedicated players additional dimensions of the world to explore. The consistency of Sinnoh's mythology across these different formats reinforced the sense that the region had been built with genuine internal logic rather than assembled from disconnected creative decisions. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon entries set in the same period drew on the same cosmological concerns, featuring rescue teams operating in a world where Pokemon were the protagonists of their own stories. The existential themes in these games, identity, time, the possibility of sacrifice for others' futures, resonated with the same register as Sinnoh's legendary mythology. Players who engaged with both experienced them as expressions of a shared set of concerns about what the world was and what it meant to exist within it. The aesthetic of Sinnoh extended into merchandise, promotional materials, and competitive events in ways that maintained the region's identity across formats. Its legendary Pokemon became recognizable as a group in ways that other generations' legendaries had not quite achieved, partly because the creation mythology gave them a structural relationship that made their grouping feel natural rather than incidental. The Snow Point Gym required players to navigate a series of snowballs that blocked the direct path to the gym leader, Candace. The puzzle required pushing these snowballs in specific directions to clear the route, and the ice floor beneath them added a physical difficulty to what was conceptually a spatial puzzle. The solution was achievable through a methodical approach, but took longer than a casual first attempt would reach. Candace herself was warm in a way that her ice-type specialization might not have predicted. She spoke about how she perceived ice, not as coldness, but as clarity, a quality of sharpness and precision that she connected to her own approach to battle and to life. This framing of ice as a quality of mind rather than a quality of temperature was an unusual characterization that gave her an intellectual coherence, matching the demanding environment of her gym. The ice types available in Sinnoh reflected the region's northern character without being limited to the kinds of creatures that a simpler approach might have assembled. Abomasnow's dual grass and ice typing reflected the ecology of snowy forests rather than simply cold for its own sake. Froslass, a ghost and ice type, connected the cold of Sinnoh's mountains to the supernatural tradition of spirits who had frozen in isolated places. The blizzard conditions on Route 216 and 217, which made movement slower and encounters more frequent with ice types, gave the northern approach to Snow Point a quality of genuine difficulty that the area's story significance required. Players arrived at Candace's city already shaped by what they had crossed to reach it. The Spearpillar sequence, in which players climbed to the summit of Mount Coronet to confront Team Galactic's final plan, was one of the most cinematically constructed moments in the series at that point. The ascent through the mountain had been made multiple times during the game, but this final climb carried the accumulated weight of everything that had been learned during those previous passages. At the summit, the stone carvings that had been glimpsed in various Sinnoh ruins were present in their most concentrated form. The entire structure of the pillar was a monument to the moment that ancient peoples had witnessed or anticipated the emergence of the creation legendaries into the physical world. Team Galactic's plan was to use this location, the place where the mythology said such events were possible, to force that emergence on their own terms. The battle at the top of the mountain was complicated by the involvement of both the Lake Guardians and, depending on the version, either Dialga or Palkia. The three small beings from the lakes appeared to interfere with Team Galactic's plan, and the legendary of the specific version confronted its summoner in a way that the mythology had suggested was possible, but that the game had not fully telegraphed would happen at this particular moment. The resolution of this crisis left something open. Cyrus disappeared into a rift that the events had created. In Platinum, the expanded version of the Sinnoh games, this thread was followed into the distortion world, where players could pursue him and find him contemplating his defeat in the realm of antimatter. The conversation that concluded there was one of the more nuanced exchanges in the series, with Cyrus expressing not remorse, but a kind of cold acceptance, while the player's character stood in a space that existed outside normal reality. Volkner was the final gym leader before the Elite Four, stationed in Sunyshore City on the eastern coast. He was described as the strongest gym leader in Sinnoh, and had grown bored in the absence of challengers worthy of his full attention. This characterization of ennui in a powerful trainer was unusual. Most gym leaders in the series were presented as enthusiastic, defined by their specialization. Volkner's detachment gave him a quality of weariness that made him more interesting as a character than straightforward confidence would have allowed. His gym used a solar panel structure that directed light to power its puzzle mechanisms. Sunyshore itself was a city built heavily on solar energy, its infrastructure reflecting an interest in sustainable technology that gave it a distinct urban identity within Sinnoh's largely nature-oriented landscape. The combination of electrical specialization with solar-powered infrastructure gave Volkner and his city a consistency between character theme and environmental design that worked well. The Elite Four of Sinnoh each had well-defined identities connected to their type specializations. Aaron's bug types, Bertha's ground types, Flint's fire types, and Lucian's psychic types formed a sequence that required genuinely varied preparation. Flint's team was expanded in the Platinum version to include more fire types, as the original Diamond and Pearl lineup was notable for having relatively few Pokémon that fit the fire designation, a reflection of the broader scarcity of fire types native to the Sinnoh region. The Pokémon League building itself sat high in the mountains at the end of Victory Road, a final test of endurance after the Elite Four's chamber awaited. Victory Road in Sinnoh was expansive, requiring the use of multiple hidden moves to traverse and containing wild encounters with powerful species that players who had come this far were expected to be able to handle. The road was a final conversation between the player and the region before the climax. The Heatran encounter at Stark Mountain held a particular quality because of the extended sequence that preceded it. Players needed to venture into Stark Mountain with a man named Buck, navigate the volcanic interior, and prevent Buck from taking a specific item from the mountain's depths. After this sequence resolved, Heatran could be found waiting in the deepest chamber. Heatran's design emerged from volcanic rock and magma aesthetics. Its 4 legs, arranged in a cross pattern, could anchor it to any surface, including ceilings and walls, which gave it a movement quality described in Pokédex entries as being at home in environments where normal locomotion was impossible. The idea of a creature that had adapted entirely to the inside of active volcanoes gave Heatran a specificity of ecological niche that distinguished it from legendaries associated with broader cosmic categories. Its fire and steel typing, unique among legendaries at the time of its introduction, gave it a competitive utility connected to its role as a tanky, pressure-applying presence in battle. The combination of resistances, provided by steel typing with the offensive presence of fire, gave teams built around Heatran a defensive anchor with offensive capability. Stark Mountain itself was atmospherically distinct from the rest of the region. Its volcanic heat was conveyed through the color palette and the environmental design, reds and oranges, and the specific Pokémon that appeared there. The contrast with Sinnoh's generally cold landscape made it feel like a genuine geographic anomaly, a piece of a warmer world preserved within the cold north. The Sinnoh games introduced the concept of the Pokémon Platinum version as an expansion of the Diamond and Pearl experience that added significant new content rather than simply adjusting a small number of elements. The Distortion world, the expanded access to the battle frontier, the additional forms for Giratina, the changes to the Elite Four teams, the addition of Shaymin's Sky form, and Rotom's new forms, all of these arrived together in a way that made Platinum function as a definitive version of the Sinnoh experience. Rotom's expanded forms gave it the ability to inhabit different appliances beyond the television in the old chateau. Each form changed its secondary typing and its signature move, giving players the option to build Rotom around specific strategies, depending on which form they selected. The heat form for ovens, the wash form for washing machines, the frost form for refrigerators, the fan form for electric fans, and the mow form for lawn mowers all embodied the same core concept of a mischievous spirit inhabiting household technology while expressing it through different elemental expressions. This expansion of Rotom's forms was implemented fully in later generations, but the seeds of the concept existed in Platinum. A ghost that could become any of several appliances was a particularly modern piece of Pokémon mythology, connecting the supernatural to the domestic in a way that echoed the old chateau's television encounter, but broadened it into a general principle. The changes to the Distortion world in Platinum made the area more navigable while preserving its fundamental disorientation. New platforms and clearer puzzle logic gave players more agency in moving through the space without eliminating the quality of existing in a place where normal assumptions did not apply. The Pokétch, the digital wristwatch application device that players carried through the region, accumulated apps throughout the journey in a way that built a record of engagement with the region's systems. The Friendship Checker app displayed heart symbols to indicate how a Pokémon felt about its trainer, a visual representation of a quality that was otherwise expressed only through mechanical outcomes like increased critical hit rates or survival of one-hit KO moves. The Dowsing Machine app replaced the dedicated key item from previous generations, integrating the function of detecting hidden items into the wristwatch interface. Using it revealed dots on the screen that moved the player toward buried objects, a small treasure hunt mechanic that encouraged thorough exploration of areas already traversed. The Berry Seeker and the Counter apps were simpler tools, but they represented the device's function as a record of ongoing activities. Players who engaged with the berry growing system used the Seeker regularly. Players who needed to count steps for egg hatching or Magikarp experience manipulation used the Counter. The Pokétch was a device that accumulated meaning through use rather than through any single dramatic function. The Pedometer app, which counted steps and converted them into watts usable in the underground, created a connection between the surface-level activity of simply moving through the world and the underground resource economy. Every step taken anywhere in Sinnoh had a use in the hidden world beneath it. This integration reinforced the idea that nothing in the region was wasted, that all movement contributed to something. The Pokémon available at certain points in Sinnoh carried details that rewarded attention to the relationship between creature and environment. Combi and its evolution, Vespiquen, were found in honey trees and in specific areas of the region. Vespiquen's design, a figure whose lower body was a hive-housing smaller Pokémon, placed the creature in the role of queen and colony simultaneously. Its moves reflected this structure, with some attacks drawing on the drones within the hive as participants rather than passive components. Carnivine was found only in the Great Marsh, its carnivorous plant design placing it in an environment consistent with the real-world ecology of such plants. Its Pokédex entries described it luring prey with its sweet smell before clamping down with its large mouth, a process parallel to actual carnivorous plant mechanisms translated into creature design. Chateau was available in Sinnoh and had a mechanic unique to it at the time. The move Chatter could be customized using the microphone on the DS, with the volume and pitch of a recorded sound affecting the move's confusion rate. This use of the hardware's input capabilities for a specific Pokemon's move was a design experiment that reflected the fourth generation's willingness to explore the full range of what the platform offered. Glameow and Purugly represented the ordinary cat Pokemon of the region, found in the wild and in the hands of Team Galactic grunts. Purugly's name and its design concept, a small cat that had grown into something incongruously large through sheer confidence, gave it a character quality that made it more memorable than its competitive profile might have suggested. The Eterna Forest was a location where the usual rules of navigation were complicated by a persistent companion. A trainer named Cheryl would walk alongside the player through the forest, healing the team after each battle and engaging double battles against the wild Pokemon encountered. This enforced partnership changed the texture of moving through the space in a way that a solo traversal would not have. The forest itself was described as a place of transformation and mystery. Moss-covered trees and ancient stone formations gave it an atmosphere consistent with places where the boundary between the ordinary world and something older might be considered thinner. The old chateau at its heart, already discussed for its haunted qualities, was accessible through the forest and could only be fully explored after obtaining the ability to navigate darkness with the appropriate hidden move. The Pokemon native to Eterna Forest included species that embodied its atmosphere. Misdreavus wandered its dark interior. Murkrow appeared in the nighttime hours. The grass-type Pokemon that inhabited its undergrowth included creatures associated with transformation and growth. The ecosystem of the forest was consistent with its narrative role as a place of mystery and transition. Gardenia, the Eterna gym leader, specialized in grass types and was one of the game's earlier gym challenges. Her enthusiasm for plant-type Pokemon and her knowledge of the city's botanical past, including the old buildings that Team Galactic had taken over, gave her a grounded quality that matched her specialization. She was someone who had spent time paying attention to the world around her, and that quality came through in her characterization. The National Pokédex completion mechanic in Sinnoh rewarded players who achieved it with the Shiny Charm in later game versions, an item that increased the probability of encountering shiny-colored Pokemon in the wild. This reward for completion acknowledged the longest-form engagement possible with the game's collection system. Shiny Pokemon had existed since the second generation as rare color variants of normal species. The probability of encountering one without assistance was extremely low, creating a category of discovery that could happen at any time but could not be reliably planned for. Players who encountered shinies unexpectedly often described the moment as one of their most memorable gaming experiences, the ordinary suddenly becoming extraordinary through a combination of routine action and rare outcome. The chain fishing and the Poke Radar were methods introduced or refined in Sinnoh to allow players to intentionally pursue shiny encounters through sustained effort. The Poke Radar, an item given after completing the Sinnoh Pokédex, could be used to build chains of encounters with the same species, with each successive link in the chain increasing the probability of a shiny appearing. Maintaining a chain required care and attention, as certain grasses within the radar's effect needed to be avoided to preserve the sequence. This system created a form of focused, meditative gameplay that appealed to a specific type of player. The sustained repetition required to build a long chain, combined with the need to pay close attention to visual details on the overworld, produced an experience of concentrated attention that some players found restful and others found unbearably tense. The possibility of the chain breaking, always present, always requiring continued vigilance. The game's relationship with time extended beyond its legendary mythology into more ordinary mechanics. The day and night cycle, which had been part of the series since the second generation, was present in Sinnoh, with effects on which Pokémon appeared in various locations. Some species were exclusive to certain hours. The Pokémon that could be encountered during a late night session were different from those available in the afternoon, giving the game a quality of variation that rewarded playing at different times. Certain evolutions required specific time conditions. Eevee could evolve into Espeon through high friendship during daylight and into Umbreon through the same friendship at night. This mechanic made the evolution feel like an expression of something about the Pokemon's nature that had been waiting to be revealed by the right conditions rather than simply a threshold that had been crossed. The calendar in the game tracked days and seasons in ways that were less developed in the original Diamond and Pearl versions, but would be expanded significantly in subsequent works. The foundation established here that time in the game mattered and had effects beyond simply unlocking day and night encounters was one that the series would build on. Sinnoh's relationship with time went all the way to its cosmological foundation. A region that housed the Pokémon, said to govern time itself, was naturally one in which time had a presence in the design that other regions had not emphasized. Every mechanic that connected player behavior to the passage of actual hours was a small expression of the same idea that the legendary mythology stated at its grandest scale. The Selacion Town Daycare allowed players to leave two compatible Pokémon and collect an egg after sufficient time and steps had passed. This breeding system had existed since the second generation, but was fully developed in Sinnoh into a foundation for competitive preparation. Passing down moves that a Pokémon could not normally learn through its own level progression, optimizing inherited statistics, and searching for specific natures through deliberate pairing all became standard practices. The complexity of the breeding system was not explicitly taught. Players who engaged with it deeply were doing so through experimentation, through community knowledge shared outside the game, and through the accumulation of experience across many hatched eggs. This depth existing below the visible surface of the game was consistent with Sinnoh's general approach to rewarding engagement that went beyond what the main story required. The relationship between the daycare and the region's landscape created a specific kind of rhythm for players focused on breeding. The route beside Selacion Town became a path walked repeatedly, accumulating steps while waiting for eggs to appear. The Pokémon left at the daycare continued their lives there, while the player traveled elsewhere, occasionally producing results that required return and collection. The daycare was a commitment that continued across the whole of a Sinnoh journey, rather than concluding at any single point. Hatching eggs anywhere in the region meant that the specific location where a player happened to be when an egg opened became part of that Pokemon's history. This meant the two players could have identical Pokemon with different specific hatching locations recorded in their data. The detail was small, but it was part of how the game made each player's experience specific to themselves, even within shared mechanical systems. The northern portions of Sinnoh, once accessible after clearing the major story obstacles, offered a landscape distinctly different from the rest of the region. The snowfields and the routes leading toward Snow Point carried a quiet that the more populated and story-intensive southern and central areas did not. Players who made it this far had been through the majority of the game's content and were moving through a part of the world that felt less constructed for progress and more simply present. The wild Pokémon in these areas were hardy species associated with cold and endurance. Snover grew in areas of significant snow accumulation. Abomasnow moved through the highest elevations. Sneasel hunted through the northern routes. These species fit the environment without being placed there simply for variety. They made sense as residents of a place with those particular qualities. Acuity Lakefront, approaching Lake Acuity, was one of the quieter approach sequences in the game. The path wound through snowy terrain toward the lake that housed Uxie, the guardian of knowledge. The combination of environmental difficulty, cold and obscured paths with destination meaning, the lake housing a being whose very gaze could erase what you knew, gave the approach a particular quality of ironic resonance that the game did not explain. The existence of these northern spaces, fully developed and populated, despite serving no essential story function, was evidence of Sinnoh's thoroughness. The region had been built completely, rather than stopping development at the boundaries of the main narrative. Every accessible corner had been given attention, and that attention accumulated into the sense that Sinnoh was a real place, rather than a path through a sequence of predetermined encounters. As we drift a little deeper into everything Sinnoh carried quietly within itself, it becomes clear that the region was built to be revisited. Each time a player returned to a familiar route or entered a building they had passed through before, there was a small chance of finding something they had not noticed the first time. A piece of dialogue that had been irrelevant before and was now relevant. A patch of tall grass that had previously held nothing of interest and now contained a Pokémon they were looking for. A book in a library that meant something different, having played further. This quality of accumulating meaning with revisitation was one of the deeper things Sinnoh offered. The myths became more significant after the legendaries were understood. The ruins became more interesting after the mythology was developed. The characters became fuller in retrospect after the conversations that preceded understanding had been had. The region rewarded the completion of its own story by making all its earlier moments more legible. The Lake Guardians, the Creation Trio, the Old Chateau's Ghost, the Honey Trees, the underground excavations, the cycling road's view, the daycare path walked 100 times, the Poke radar chain maintained in careful silence, the fog near Celestic cleared to move forward, the frozen northern lakes, the volcano at the region's geological edge, the champion who understood everything and still had to wait for someone worthy to arrive. All of these were Sinnoh. They were pieces of a region that took the idea of mystery seriously, that treated the world as a place containing things not yet fully explained, and that offered players the opportunity to live inside that quality of unresolved wonder for as long as they wanted to stay. The mountains held their shapes. The lakes stayed still. The myths remained what they had always been. And the stories continued long after the credits showed themselves and faded, carried forward by everyone who had crossed Mount Coronet and looked back at the shape of the world from the other side. The Pokémon contest system in Sinnoh deserves further consideration because of how it functioned as a parallel world within the game, one governed by completely different values from the battle system that structured most of the experience, where battles rewarded power, speed, and strategic foresight, contests rewarded care, preparation, and an understanding of the relationship between a Pokémon's moves and their performance on a stage. A powerful attack could be a poor contest move. A status move that seemed weak in battle could be exactly the right choice in a performance context. This inversion of values was not accidental. The contest system existed partly to suggest that the way a Pokémon was understood in one context was not the whole of what it was. A creature trained for raw combat power might be completely unsuited for the stage, not because it lacked ability, but because the abilities it possessed were expressed differently in different settings. The same move that dealt devastating damage in battle might lack the visual elegance required for a strong performance score. Players who engaged with both systems reported finding Pokemon they had overlooked for battle becoming newly interesting through contests, and vice versa. A Pokemon like Melodic, often noted for its defensive stats and elegant design, was also a strong contest performer, suggesting a consistency between its visual language and its mechanical identity across both systems. Sinnoh embraced this kind of multi-layered characterization, treating creatures as having qualities that different contexts would reveal differently. The poffin cooking process required attention to berry types and their flavor profiles. Berries with a single strong flavor produced poffins that raised one condition sharply. Berries with mixed flavor profiles produced smoother, less intense poffins that raised multiple conditions in smaller amounts. Players who optimized for contest mastery built knowledge of berry cultivation and flavor chemistry that existed entirely outside the game's main story. This knowledge existed for its own sake, accumulated through engagement with a system that rewarded it on its own terms. The Super Contest's rhythm-based performance segment added yet another dimension. Players timed button presses to musical beats, and doing so successfully generated appeal from the audience that contributed to the overall performance score. This brief musical engagement between player and game was a small reminder that Sinnoh contained experiences that no amount of narrative progression could provide on its own. Wayward Cave was a location accessible through the underside of Cycling Road, hidden behind a gap in the wall that players might pass multiple times without noticing. The cave had two sections. The first was accessible without any knowledge of the hidden entrance and contained useful items and Pokemon appropriate to its depth. The second required finding the concealed gap and contained stronger wild Pokemon, including Gible in specific areas. Gible was the base form of the Garchomp line and was notable for being relatively difficult to find outside this particular hidden section of the cave. Players who discovered the hidden entrance and explored its depths could find Gible earlier than the mountain location where it also appeared. This kind of layered availability, where persistence and curiosity were rewarded with access to a creature others might obtain much later, was consistent with Sinnoh's approach to exploration as a meaningful activity rather than simply a means of reaching the next story beat. The darkness of Wayward Cave required the use of Flash or the HM defog to navigate with any clarity. This mechanical requirement for a hidden location created a small barrier between casual traversal and thorough exploration. Players who made the effort to deal with the visibility conditions found the cave's deeper areas were worth the investment, not only for Gible, but for the sense of having gone somewhere not everyone who played the game had found. Finding areas like Wayward Cave's hidden section created a specific kind of memory. Players who discovered it accidentally, walking along the cycling road, and falling through a gap they hadn't anticipated, described the experience as genuinely surprising in a way that deliberately searched for content rarely was. The game had hidden something in plain sight and waited for the player to find it without instruction. The Galactic Key and the various access cards used to navigate Team Galactic's facilities created a system of gated progress that made infiltrating their bases feel like genuine penetration of a working organization rather than a straightforward dungeon progression. Obtaining these items through story events or through defeating specific characters gave each new access point a sense of having been earned through conflict rather than simply arrived at. The Galactic Warehouse in Veilstone, accessible through the Galactic Key, held items and context that expanded understanding of the organization's operations. The storage systems, the layout, the incidental dialogue from grunts who had not anticipated an intruder all contributed to a sense of organizational reality. Team Galactic was not simply a group of obstacles, it was a functioning structure with logistics, hierarchy, and internal culture. Commander Saturn's position within the organization gave him a role distinct from the ground level grunts. His interactions with the player, over the course of multiple confrontations, accumulated into something more than simple opposition. The final interaction in the distortion world's aftermath, where he expressed a kind of uncertainty about the ideology he had served, was a small but meaningful moment that acknowledged the possibility of change in characters who had begun as antagonists. The aftermath of Team Galactic's defeat was handled in the game with the kind of quiet resolution that matched Sinnoh's general approach to consequence. The crisis had been averted. The space that had opened had closed. Cyrus was gone. The world continued. Players who returned to Veilstone after the story's conclusion found that certain elements had changed and others had not, a mixture of aftermath that felt consistent with the way large events actually settle into ordinary reality. The fishing system in Sinnoh used 3 rods of increasing effectiveness. The old rod was obtained early and caught mostly Magikarp. The good rod expanded options considerably. The super rod opened access to species not available through other methods. This tiered approach to aquatic encounters made the progression of fishing ability feel parallel to the progression of the main journey. Early access gave limited results. Later access revealed a fuller picture of what the region's waters contained. Sinnoh's rivers and lakes held species that reflected their specific environments. The colder northern waters contained different Pokémon than the warmer southern coastal areas. Fishing in Sunyshore's ocean was different from fishing in the mountain lakes, and both were different from the rivers that connected inland settlements. This environmental consistency in aquatic distribution matched the surface-level ecological approach throughout the region. Phoebus was the aquatic equivalent of Sinnoh's patience-rewarding encounters, available only in specific squares of water in a locations on Mount Coronet, the exact positions of which changed daily and could only be identified through methodical fishing of every accessible square. Phoebus required dedication to find that bordered on obsessive. Its design, a plain and unremarkable fish, gave no visual indication of its value. Players who found and then evolved it into melodic through the Pokemon Amity system that measured beauty condition received a creature whose elegance was in stark contrast to the ordinariness of what they had started with. This narrative, embedded in the evolutionary mechanic, the plain fish transformed into something beautiful through care and attention, was one of Sinnoh's quieter stories. It required no Pokédex entry to communicate. The experience of finding the unremarkable thing, investing in it, and watching the transformation complete the process told the story in full. The Hearthome Gyms puzzle was one of the more theatrically designed in the region. The ghost-type focus of gym leader Fantina was reflected not just in the type, but in the sense of the building itself as a performance space. The trainers within the gym spoke in riddles and moved in patterns that suggested choreography rather than random patrol. The entire structure had the quality of something rehearsed. Fantina herself was described as someone who had come to Sinnoh from elsewhere. She had not grown up in the region, but had been drawn to it, and her status as an outsider who had made herself central to the culture of one of Sinnoh's major cities gave her a different kind of presence from gym leaders who were natives. She had chosen Sinnoh. That choice was part of who she was. Her ghost types, Duskull and Haunter lines, and the more powerful Miss Magus at the center of her late-game team, were presented with a theatrical confidence that matched the contest aesthetic the gym shared with the contest hall nearby. Battles against her felt less like obstacle and more like performance, which was consistent with her entire presentation. She was not testing whether the player could defeat ghosts. She was showing what she knew about them. The ghost types of Sinnoh carried a shared aesthetic that was distinct from the ghost types of earlier generations. The original ghost trio of Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar were gaseous and vaguely sinister. Sinnoh's ghost designs ranged from the mournful elegance of Miss Drevis and Miss Magus to the technological haunting of Rotom to the bound spirit mythology of Spiritomb. Together, they suggested a more diverse understanding of what haunting meant and what forms it could take. The connection between Sinnoh and the real-world practice of archaeology was developed through multiple game systems. The underground digging, the ruins at multiple locations, the fossils available in the game, and the academic interest of characters like the Ruin Maniac at Selection all pointed toward the same underlying theme. The past was physically present in this region. You could find it in the ground, excavate it, revive it, place it in your team. The fossil revival system in Sinnoh produced Cranidos and Shieldon from the skull and armor fossils respectively. Cranidos, the basis of Rampardos, was a dinosaur-based design with massive cranial plating that suggested an animal whose entire evolutionary direction had been toward head-based impact. Its design was almost caricaturally committed to this idea, the head enormous, the body secondary, the creature appearing as though the head had decided to acquire a body purely for locomotion purposes. Shieldon's evolution into Bastodon produced one of the game's most visually striking defensive designs. The face was a flat, armored wall. The body was a walking fortress. Its typing, rock, and steel gave it an extraordinary number of resistances at the cost of specific and significant weaknesses that made it a nuanced choice in competitive settings rather than a simple tank. The design communicated its mechanical identity with complete clarity. Looking at Bastiodon, you understood immediately what it was for. The process of reviving fossil Pokémon required visiting a specific building in Oreburgh City, the same city that housed the region's first gym and was built around mining as its primary industry. The connection between a mining community, archaeological excavation, and fossil revival was not coincidental. Oreburgh City was a place defined by its relationship with what lay beneath the surface, and fossil revival fit naturally into its industrial and cultural context. Eterna City was built around its relationship with ancient things. The Pokémon statue in the center of the city depicted a creature that Pokémon researchers in the region were working to identify. An old mystery that the game left unresolved, but which keen players connected to Arceus through the shape of the depicted being. The statue's presence in the middle of an otherwise ordinary city gave Eterna a quality of having been built around something whose significance was not fully understood. The Eterna building, a tall tower in the city occupied by Team Galactic as their base, was one of the earlier major encounters with the organization, in a context that went beyond simple route obstruction. The building had multiple floors and required navigation of Team Galactic's personnel and security to reach the goal of freeing the Pokémon stored there. This infiltration sequence introduced the player to the organization's methods in a way that placed their activities in a specific and uncomfortable light. The honey trees near Eterna Forest, the bicycle shop that provided the upgrade needed for the cycling road, and the moss-covered rock where Eevee could evolve into Leafeon were all accessible from or near Eterna. The city functioned as a hub for multiple different kinds of engagement, each reflecting a different aspect of what the region had to offer. It was not a city defined by a single quality, but by an accumulation of small, significant things that rewarded extended presence. Professor Rowan's laboratory in Sandgem Town had established the region's academic character from the beginning, but Eterna's older, more architectural presence suggested that Sinnoh's interest in knowledge was not purely scientific. The ancient statue, the forest myths, the ruins nearby, all pointed toward a form of inquiry that was older than formal research and more embedded in the region's own history. The music of Sinnoh carried its atmosphere in ways that players who experienced the games in their original form remembered for years afterward. The routes had melodies that matched their qualities. The snowy northern paths had a cold, sparse quality. The forest routes were layered and slightly unsettling without being dramatic. The cities had distinct themes that reflected their characters. Hearthome's theme, ornate and slightly melancholy. Jubilife's theme, faster and more urban. Celestic's theme, slower and more ancient. The battle themes escalated appropriately. Wild Pokémon battles had an urgency that kept encounters from feeling trivial. Trainer battles had a different texture. The gym battles had their own themes. The rival battle music had an intensity that the game used to communicate the seriousness of those encounters without relying on narrative explanation. The Team Galactic theme communicated the organization's particular combination of cold efficiency and genuine menace in tones rather than words. The legendary battle themes were remarkable. The music that played during encounters with Dialga and Palkia communicated scale in a way that visual design alone could not have fully achieved. The music placed those encounters in a different register from anything else the game contained, signaling through sound that what was happening required a different quality of attention. The Route 209 music was gentle and slightly melancholy, matching the area's proximity to the Lost Tower. The Route 201 theme, the very first route music encountered in the game, was designed to be welcoming and familiar without being empty. Many players described returning to that first route late in the game and finding that the familiar music had accumulated new meaning, its simplicity now readable as a beginning rather than simply a start. The concept of friendship in Sinnoh extended beyond the mechanical friendship system that measured how much a Pokémon trusted its trainer. The game's narrative returned repeatedly to the idea that the relationship between Pokémon and humans was foundational to the world's functioning, not simply as a convenience or a tool, but as something mutual and necessary. The Lake Guardians had created the human spirit from a fragment of Arceus, according to the oldest myths of the region. This origin story tied human existence directly to Pokémon in a way that inverted the usual assumption about who was essential to whom. The mythology of Sinnoh suggested that humans existed because of a gift from Pokémon, that the capacity for emotion and knowledge and will was not something humans had developed on their own, but something they had been given. This inversion placed every relationship between trainer and Pokémon within a context of debt and reciprocity rather than ownership and use. The game never stated this directly, but the mythology was there for any player who read the library books and followed the implications of what they said. The region had been built on an understanding that the bond between species was the most fundamental thing about the world. Riley's practice of aura reading was an expression of this understanding at the individual level. Someone who could perceive the emotional states of the Pokémon around him and respond to them was demonstrating a capacity for connection that the mythology described as inherent to humanity, but that most people had not cultivated. That Riley had cultivated it, and that his cultivation had produced a sustained relationship with Lucario expressed through mutual understanding rather than simple obedience, was a small illustration of what the mythology described at cosmic scale. The PAL Park, accessible through Route 221 after completing the National Pokédex, allowed players to migrate Pokémon from earlier generation games through the use of a connected Game Boy Advance. This bridge between generations was technically elaborate but narratively simple in what it expressed. The world had always been larger than any single game had been able to show. Pokémon caught in Hoenn or Kanto had lives that continued in Sinnoh. The regions were connected, and connection was possible for those willing to make the effort. The migration process was not fast. It required preparation in the previous game, physical transport of both cartridges, and a catching minigame within the PAL Park itself. Players who moved beloved creatures from earlier adventures into Sinnoh described the arrival of those Pokémon in the new region as something that felt meaningful beyond its mechanical function. A creature that had traveled the whole of Hoenn was now walking through Sinnoh's roots. The history of that Pokémon was continuous. This continuity of individual Pokémon history across games was one of the things that made the series' broader appeal so durable. Players formed attachments not to the game systems or to the region designs, but to specific creatures that they had named, trained, and carried through adventures. When those creatures could continue existing across new games, the attachment persisted. Palpark's function as a mechanism for that continuation was simple but important. The Pokémon that became available through the National Pokédex and Palpark expanded the ecology of Sinnoh dramatically. Species from all previous regions could now be found in various locations, inserted into the landscape in ways that the designers had specified. This expanded roster gave the region a different quality in late-game exploration, the familiar appearing in new contexts, offering the pleasure of reunion alongside the pleasure of discovery. The Pokétch app that displayed the time connected the in-game experience to the actual world in a small but persistent way. The clock running alongside the game meant that the time shown on the wristwatch was real time rather than accelerated game time. Looking at the Pokétch's clock during a late evening session showed an actual hour. The game and the world it was being played in were sharing time rather than the game operating at its own separate pace. This small connection between game world and real world contributed to the quality of immersion that many players described experiencing during their Sinnoh journeys. The day and night cycles ran on real hours. The daycare produced eggs based on actual steps walked. The honey trees required actual waiting time. The berry gardens grew over actual hours and days. Sinnoh required investment of real time in ways that increased the sense that what happened within it mattered beyond its own context. Players who began their Sinnoh journey in certain seasons described the experience as colored by those seasons in ways they could not fully explain. A winter playthrough had a different quality from a summer one, not because the game changed, but because the player's relationship to cold and darkness and stillness during those months created a resonance with the northern landscape. The game's sensitivity to real time made this kind of accidental synchrony possible. The final moments of the Sinnoh story, standing at Spearpillar or walking out of the Pokémon League after defeating Cynthia, carried a quality of completion that the region's scale had prepared. The journey had been long, and its dimensions had been many. The mechanical completion of the story was accompanied by a sense of having been somewhere fully, of having given attention to a world that had given something back. That quality, the sense of mutual exchange between the player's attention and the world's depth, was what distinguished Sinnoh from regions that were simply settings for stories. Sinnoh was a place that took seriously the question of what a world would have to contain to feel genuinely inhabited by history, and the answer it offered, myths older than language, a mountain at the center of everything, 3 lakes holding the qualities that made humanity human, creatures that governed time and space and the forces that opposed them, a ghost in a television, a plain fish that became something beautiful, berries growing in the real world's time, all of it together was enough. The mysteries of Sinnoh do not resolve. They deepen with familiarity, becoming more rather than less interesting the more fully they are understood. The region was built that way, and for those who found their way into its snowfields and its ancient ruins and its quiet libraries and its underground world, it has never entirely released its hold. Some places stay with you. Sinnoh is one of them. The Pokémon that players brought back from all regions are created in Sinnoh's late-game landscape, a kind of living anthology of everything the series had built. Standing in the tall grass of a late-game route, with the National Pokédex active and the day deepening toward evening, Encountering a Pokémon from the first generation in a landscape from the fourth was one of those experiences unique to a franchise that had taken the time to build a world large enough to hold that kind of reunion. That is what Sinnoh ultimately offered at its fullest. Not simply a new set of challenges or a new legendary to find, but a region capacious enough to hold the weight of everything the franchise had become while remaining entirely itself. Ancient and modern, quiet and cosmic, full of things waiting to be found. Sinnoh asked something of the people who played it that not every region did. It asked for patience, for the willingness to read text that offered no immediate mechanical reward, for the acceptance that some things in the world would remain genuinely unexplained, and that this unexplained quality was a feature of the world rather than an oversight in its design, for the willingness to walk a route a second time and find it changed by everything that had happened since the first time, for the capacity to stand in front of a sealed door and understand that the door being sealed meant something about what was on the other side. The games built around Sinnoh, the Diamond and Pearl of the original release, and the Platinum that completed them, were made at a point in the franchise where ambition and craft were aligned. The team understood what they wanted to say and had the tools to say it. The region that resulted from that alignment was not the most immediately accessible or the most mechanically streamlined, but it was the one that had the most to offer to players willing to give it the kind of attention it had been built to reward. For the players who found their way into its northern cold and stayed long enough to understand what was being said, Sinnoh remains one of those places that exists in memory with unusual completeness. Not as a sequence of events or a set of challenges overcome, but as a place that was genuinely somewhere, inhabited by its own history and its own myths, carrying the weight of questions it had no interest in answering quickly. The Pokémon that inhabited Sinnoh's roots in the middle sections of the region carried details that rewarded players who paid attention to more than their type matchups. Route 206, running beneath the cycling road and through a tunnel passage, held a particular compressed quality. The overpass above meant that daylight reached it at angles rather than directly, giving the path a dimness in certain stretches that changed the texture of moving through it. Players who passed through this route multiple times often found themselves pausing in ways they could not entirely explain, the atmosphere asking for a slower pace without any mechanical reason to comply. Stunky and its evolution. Skuntank were among the species native to Diamond that reflected Sinnoh's willingness to include creatures whose design leaned into the ordinary and the unglamorous. Skuntank was not a creature built around a cosmic theme or a legendary quality. It was simply a large skunk that had adapted to the world it lived in and carried itself with a confidence proportionate to the effectiveness of its defenses. Its dark and poison typing gave it a competitive utility that exceeded what its design suggested at a glance, and players who underestimated it often remembered that underestimation clearly. Glameow's evolutionary line existed in Pearl with the same quality of straightforward animal presence. Purugly had been designed around a cat that had grown beyond its original dimensions through pure attitude, and the resulting design was one that inspired a specific kind of recognition in players who had met animals that similarly refused to acknowledge any incongruity between their sense of themselves and their actual circumstances. These ordinary creatures of Sinnoh, present without legendary purpose or mythological connection, gave the region's ecology a texture that the cosmic designs alone could not have provided. The relationship between the Pearl-exclusive and Diamond-exclusive Pokémon created a system of version differentiation that gave players in both versions a slightly different understanding of the region's population. The creatures exclusive to each version were not simply different collectibles. They were different inhabitants of the same world, suggesting that the ecology of Sinnoh extended beyond what any single journey could fully encounter. The relic stone at the center of Celestic Town served a function that the game did not fully explain through its main narrative, but made clear through the existence of the shrine keeper who tended it. The stone was old enough that the townspeople treated it not as a historical artifact, but as a living part of their community, something that required ongoing care rather than simply preservation. The distinction between a monument and an object of active relationship was one that Sinnoh made quietly in many places. The shrine keeper at Celestic was connected to Cynthia through family, which meant that the person responsible for maintaining the region's oldest physical connection to its deepest mythology was also the grandmother of the region's most powerful trainer. This familial continuity between the oldest responsibilities and the highest achievements felt deliberate. Sinnoh was a region where the deepest engagements with its history were not academic or political, but personal and inherited. The murals within the Celestic ruins depicted the creation events in a visual language, different from the written records in the Canalave Library. The pictorial tradition and the textual tradition of Sinnoh's mythology were parallel rather than identical, each containing elements the other did not fully express. Players who engaged with both could construct a more complete picture of the events they described, but neither source was complete on its own. This deliberate incompleteness in the available records gave the mythology a quality of genuine historical documentation rather than convenient game backstory. Team Galactic's interest in the Celestic ruins was connected to their leader's specific interpretation of what the murals meant and what they implied was possible. Cyrus read the records of cosmic creation as a blueprint rather than a history. The distinction between understanding a myth as something that happened and understanding it as something that could be made to happen again was the center of everything he believed. Celestic's ruins were valuable to him, not because they preserved the past, but because he understood them as instructions for the future. Cyrus's personal history, revealed in fragments through NPC dialogue and specific in-game documents, described a childhood defined by an inability to connect emotionally with others, and an early conclusion that the capacity for emotion was the source of all conflict and suffering. This intellectual framework for personal isolation was unusual in a franchise that generally treated villainy in simpler terms. Cyrus had not been wronged by the world in a way that produced anger or resentment. He had observed the world, reached a conclusion about its fundamental flaw, and dedicated himself to correction. The coldness of his presentation throughout the game reflected this framework. He was not cruel in the conventional sense. He did not enjoy causing harm or take satisfaction from power over others. He simply treated people and Pokémon as variables in an equation whose solution would render them unnecessary. When players confronted him at various points in the story, the conversations they had were not arguments about values so much as two parties operating from entirely incompatible premises about what the world was for. His relationship with the commanders who served him was consistent with this framework. They were useful. He did not treat them as colleagues or subordinates in the usual sense. Saturn's eventual uncertainty about the ideology he had served arose partly because he had observed over time that Cyrus's vision would leave no place within it for anyone at all, including those who had helped bring it about. The person who wanted to eliminate spirit and emotion from the universe was not offering his followers a better world. He was offering the end of the one that existed. The post-game content in Platinum that allowed players to encounter Cyrus in the distortion world provided a moment that the main storyline had not quite reached. Standing in the realm of antimatter, separated from the world he had tried to remake, he expressed something that the game's structure suggested was the closest to peace he had ever been. Whether this was resignation, defeat, or something more complicated was left entirely to interpretation. The game did not resolve it. Some things in Sinnoh were not meant to be resolved. The Iron Islands served a function in the game's pacing that was easy to overlook. They arrived at a point in the story where the player had covered substantial ground, but had not yet reached the northern regions that would define the final arc. Riley's presence offered a form of companionship that the game did not provide through the main rivalry or through the support characters who periodically appeared in the story. He was simply there, calm and focused, walking through a place that suited him. The nature of the island's industrial past, present in the architecture but no longer active, created a particular kind of landscape. Working environments that have been abandoned carry a different quality from ruins that have never been anything else. The Iron Islands showed evidence of purpose, and then the absence of that purpose, the infrastructure remaining after the activity that justified it had ended. The Pokémon that had moved into the vacated spaces yet adapted to an environment shaped by human activity, but no longer dependent on it. Steelix moving through the rock formation beneath the surface was one of those encounters that rewarded attention to the relationship between creature and habitat. The creature's evolution from Onyx required a metal coat trade, a specific condition that connected the transformation to the presence of refined metal, appropriate for a creature that became essentially a living geological formation of steel. Finding one in the rock-filled depths of an abandoned mining island placed it in a context that made its existence feel ecologically plausible rather than arbitrary. The egg that Riley offered at the conclusion of the Iron Islands visit was given without extensive explanation. The Riolu inside would become whatever the player's choices and care made it. This handoff was one of the game's quieter gestures, a character who understood something about the world, offering the player an opportunity to develop their own relationship with a creature that embodied the principles he himself practiced. The egg was not a reward for completing a task. It was an extension of a connection. The national park at Selacion functioned differently from most gathering places for wild Pokémon in the game. The town itself was small and focused, notable primarily for the daycare and the ruins. The addition of Pokémon news reporting, which gave players specific Pokémon to catch each day in exchange for rewards, created a recurring engagement with the area that gave it a quality of ongoing relevance rather than a single visit and departure. The news mechanic was simple in its execution, but interesting in what it implied about the world. There was a publication in Sinnoh that covered Pokémon activities and distributed that information to the public, and people responded to that information by going out to find what had been reported. This small detail of a media ecosystem within the game's world was never developed beyond this single mechanic, but its existence suggested a region with a functioning civic life that extended beyond the League and the story's conflict. The Pokémon reported for capture could include species not available elsewhere in the region at that time, which gave the daily report a practical value that encouraged players to pay attention to it. The combination of civic detail and mechanical reward was typical of how Sinnoh embedded its world building into systems that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The newspaper existed because the world was the kind of world where such things existed, and it also existed because it gave players a reason to return. Selacion Town's connection to the Unown through the ruins gave it a depth that the small town's surface would not have suggested. The ruins were accessible to the north of the town and extended further as the player caught more Unown forms, the ruin maniac tunneling deeper with each completion milestone. This dynamic, where a player's activity in one system directly changed the physical geography of a related location, was one of Sinnoh's more unusual design choices. The design of Sinnoh's Elite Four reflected the region's aesthetic concerns in ways that extended beyond type specialization. Aaron, the bug-type specialist, was young and carried a quality of earnestness that distinguished him from the more seasoned members who followed. His position as the first member encountered placed him in the role of a beginning, a point of entry into a sequence that would escalate in every dimension. His team included Beautifully and Dustox, creatures whose evolutionary lines connected to transformation through a cocoon stage, a recurring motif in bug-type design that Sinnoh handled with particular attention. Vespiqan's presence in his team gave it a strategic center that rewarded preparation, but also punished assumptions. Players who had encountered Vespiquen before understood its defensive capability. Those who hadn't learned quickly. Bertha's ground-type team reflected a philosophy of endurance and weight, creatures that held their ground through sheer durability rather than speed or explosive offense. Her personal history, suggested through dialogue rather than explicit backstory, indicated someone who had spent years working within the landscape of Sinnoh in the same way the ground-type Pokémon she favored had spent their existence in it. She had a quality of someone who had seen many challengers and found each one interesting without being impressed by any particular one. Flint's fire-type team in the Platinum version was expanded to address the criticism that the original lineup had relied too heavily on Pokémon that were not fire types simply because the region offered fewer fire-type options. The expanded roster gave his team a coherence that matched his personality, bright and direct, without obscuring the challenge he represented. The encounter with Flint was one of the later Elite Four battles that felt genuinely dangerous, even to prepared teams. Lucian's Psychic-type team closed the Elite Four sequence and served as the final preparation for Cynthia's challenge. His Galad and Mr. Mime and Alakazam placed him in a tradition of Psychic-type specialists that stretched back to the first generation, but his design as a reader, a person who carried books and spoke with precision, gave the type association a cerebral quality that earlier specialists had not quite achieved. He felt like someone who had thought carefully about the relationships between mind and battle and arrived at conclusions he found elegant. The psychic types of Sinnoh expanded on the category in ways that built on its existing mythology. Alakazam's intelligence had been established since the earliest entries. Galad's martial precision added a different dimension, a psychic type that expressed its mental qualities through physical form rather than through remote influence. The design was unusual in being a fighting and psychic combination, a physical manifestation of mental clarity. Cynthia's team waited on the other side of Lucian's challenge, and the gap between completing the Elite Four and standing before the champion was brief enough that players arrived in that final room still shaped by what they had just experienced. The combination of Spiritomb's defensive typing, Roserade's speed, Togekiss's bulk, Lucario's versatility, Melodic's resilience, and Garchomp's overwhelming offensive presence created a team that tested every aspect of preparation simultaneously. Well, the champion was not simply a power test. The construction of Cynthia's team suggested a trainer who had thought deeply about what a complete team meant, one that had no obvious exploitable pattern, whose members supported each other across a range of scenarios, whose individual strengths were real, but whose collective function was greater than any single creature's contribution. Defeating that team required the player to have developed a similar understanding of their own team, even if that understanding had been built through failure rather than prior design. The Safari Zone equivalent in Sinnoh, the Great Marsh, had one additional feature that distinguished it from previous implementations of the concept. The watchtower at the entrance, where players could use binoculars to survey the marsh before entering, was not simply a preview mechanic. It created a moment of observation before participation, a pause in which the player looked at the world before entering it. This small structural choice gave the approach to the Great Marsh a quality of deliberateness that the usual immediate entry format did not. The binoculars showed Pokémon moving through the marsh in real time. Watching creatures move through an environment without being able to interact with them yet was an experience that the series rarely provided. Most Pokémon encounters happened because the player had entered the space where they lived, The binoculars reverse this, placing the player outside the space and the Pokemon within it, observable but not yet accessible. The Pokemon that moved through the marsh carried their ecologies on their bodies in visible ways. Quagsire's round, unfocused quality was perfectly suited to wetland movement. Yanma's wings and compound eyes reflected an insect that had evolved entirely around rapid response and aerial agility. Bibarel's dam building mythology connected it to the stream and bank environments of the marsh in ways that the binocular view allowed a player to appreciate before the encounter mechanics made everything about efficiency. The daily rotation of rare species in the marsh meant that players who wanted specific creatures needed to visit on specific days or be prepared for the possibility that what they came for was not available on this particular visit. This design choice embedded the marsh in the experience of multiple sessions rather than allowing it to be exhausted in a single visit. The marsh was a place you returned to, and each return was slightly different from the last. The concept of the Pokétch was developed not simply as a utility belt of mechanics, but as an object that accumulated history through use. Players who had used the Dowsing Machine app extensively had found items that were now part of their inventory. Players who had used the Friendship Checker repeatedly had watched small hearts change size as relationships developed. The app that displayed the time had shown hours of play accumulating across days and weeks. This quality of the Pokétch as a record was not made explicit anywhere in the game. It was simply present in the nature of the device's function. The combination of a real-time clock and multiple systems that operated over real time meant that looking at the Pokétch late in a journey was like looking at a small summary of everything that had been done with it. The watch knew how long you had been in Sinnoh, even if you had not been counting. The step counter app, which incremented with each step taken anywhere in the game, was the most literal expression of this recording function. Its count went up every time the player moved. By the end of a thorough exploration of the region, a player who had used the step counter from the beginning had accumulated a number that represented their entire physical presence in Sinnoh, every route walked, every cave traversed, every circular path in front of the daycare. The application that displayed the number of Pokemon seen and caught provided a different kind of record, the summary of all the encounters the player had initiated and completed. These numbers told a story about how a player had spent their time in the region, which priorities they had pursued, which they had deferred, which they had not considered. The Pokétch was a device that remembered things even when the player did not. The relationship between the in-game day of the week and specific Pokemon availability was one of Sinnoh's more unusual connections to real time. The 7-day cycle meant that some encounters were genuinely weekly rather than daily or constant. Players who had missed a specific weekly availability needed to wait for the cycle to come around again. This design choice treated real time not simply as a parameter affecting day and night encounters, but as a calendar with its own significance. The weekly cycle also affected certain NPC interactions and item availability in ways that encouraged players to check in with the region regularly rather than exhausting everything available in a single extended session. Sinnoh was built to be revisited across actual days, not simply played to completion and set aside. This ongoing relationship between the player and the game's systems was different from the experience of a game designed to be completed in a defined period. The berry growing system reinforced this quality. Berries planted in soft soil grew over hours that corresponded to actual time passing. Coming back to the game the next day to check on planted berries was a form of tending to something that had continued existing while you were elsewhere. The region persisted in your absence. Things changed without you. Returning was not simply resuming, but checking in with what had happened. This aspect of Sinnoh's design anticipated qualities of ongoing engagement that would become central to later games in the franchise. But it did so in ways that felt natural to the region's thematic concerns rather than as explicit features. A region built around the mythology of time would naturally extend its relationship with time into the mechanics of how it was experienced. The connection was not incidental. The region and its systems were expressions of the same underlying idea. The design of Sinnoh's towns followed a pattern of differentiation that gave each settlement a distinct quality even when their functions overlapped. Pastoria City's association with marshland and water types gave it a humid, slightly overgrown quality, distinct from the crisp cold of Snow Point. Canalave City's maritime character, its bridges over dark water, and its ship connections to other areas gave it a working port quality that no other Sinnoh city matched. Veilstone's meteorites and department store gave it an urban texture that sat oddly alongside the criminality operating within its largest building. Jubilife City occupied a position as Sinnoh's most modern and metropolitan settlement, complete with a television station and a trainer school. Its infrastructure suggested a city engaged in communications and education rather than in mining or commerce or worship. The TV station at its center was accessible to players who completed certain tasks and offered in-game broadcast content that provided additional world detail for players who sought it out. Oreburg's mining character was established immediately through its visual design, the rock and steel aesthetics of its infrastructure, and through the mine that functioned as both an explorable location and a background detail of the city's economy. The mine stretched beneath the city and contained fossils, Pokémon encounters appropriate to its depth, and eventually the acknowledgement that the underground world of Sinnoh extended far beneath even working mines. Floroma Town's floral character, already discussed for its aesthetic qualities, was grounded in a founding myth accessible through NPC dialogue. The story went that the land around Floroma had once been barren, and that the flowers appeared after someone expressed gratitude to the Pokémon of the region. This origin, gratitude expressed to Pokémon transforming a barren place into a blooming one, was a small myth perfectly proportionate to the small town it explained, and one that carried the same value system as the region's larger mythology. The cave systems of Sinnoh constituted a parallel geography beneath the surface that exceeded what most players initially expected. The caverns beneath Mount Coronet were among the most extensive in the series, requiring the use of multiple hidden moves to navigate fully and containing some of the region's rarest encounters, alongside its most significant story locations. The cave was not simply a passage from one side to the other, it was a place in itself. Victory Road, the final cave system before the Pokémon League, was designed with the cumulative challenge that the role required. Every obstacle it contained had a parallel in something the player had already overcome during the main journey, reminding them through the need for specific abilities and battle-ready Pokémon of everything that had been developed and acquired. The design of Victory Road was retrospective as well as progressive, a final accounting of whether the journey had produced the preparation the destination required. The Pokémon encountered within Victory Road were appropriate to its position as the final gauntlet. Golbat, Graveler, and Floatzel were familiar enough to navigate without complete surprise, while remaining genuinely challenging to unprepared teams. The wild encounters in Victory Road were not obstacles to be avoided, but engagements that consumed resources, which meant that teams arrived at the league shaped by what the road had taken from them, as well as what they had brought in. The layout of Victory Road required movement through multiple floors, connected by ledges, stairs, and sections requiring specific hidden moves to open. Players who had obtained the full range of necessary moves could navigate it fully. Those who had been selective about which moves they taught their teams encountered gates they could not open and had to choose routes that bypassed certain areas. The cave rewarded thoroughness without punishing selectiveness, absolutely. The Pokémon associated with Sinnoh's North particularly those available on the routes between Celestic Town and Snow Point, carried ecological details that fit the landscape they inhabited. Snover grew in areas of significant snowfall, its body designed around the fir tree in a way that made it visually inseparable from its habitat. Its presence in the northern routes felt like an encounter with the landscape itself rather than simply with an animal that happened to live there. The transition from Snover to Abomasnow changed the scale of that relationship. Where Snover was small enough to seem part of the forest understory, Abomasnow was large enough that the blizzard conditions it generated affected the entire environment around it. Its ability to summon hail when entering battle was an expression of this scale, a creature whose presence changed the weather of the space it occupied. Meeting one in the wild felt like encountering a local weather event rather than simply a powerful Pokémon. Swinub's evolutionary line concluded with Mamoswine, an ice and ground type whose design drew from the woolly mammoth with a directness that was rare, even for a series comfortable with direct zoological inspiration. The mammoth imagery gave Mamoswine a sense of geological time, a creature that looked like it had persisted through conditions that had reshaped continents. Its connection to Sinnoh's northern cold placed it appropriately among the region's associations with ancient things. The ice types available to players in Sinnoh carried a collective quality of endurance that matched the environment they came from. They were not creatures defined primarily by offensive power, though many had genuine offensive capability. They were creatures defined by having adapted to conditions that other species had not survived, and that quality of successful persistence gave them a presence that transcended their type classification. The development of the character Dawn or Lucas, the player's counterpart in Sinnoh, reflected a design philosophy that had been evolving since the series began. The rival character in Sinnoh was notably different from some predecessors, in that the relationship was not primarily competitive. Barry's impulsiveness and the player's methodical approach to the journey created a dynamic that was affectionate rather than antagonistic, even when the rival battles themselves were genuine tests. Barry's running, his constant impression of being in too much of a hurry, was not simply a character quirk, but a commentary on a particular way of moving through the world. He was always heading toward the next thing, barely pausing to absorb what he had just experienced. His relationship with his father Palmer, discovered gradually through the game's structure and the Battle Frontier's placement, added a complexity to his characterization that the surface enthusiasm did not initially suggest. The player character's silent protagonist quality in Sinnoh, present throughout the series, but more noticeable in a region whose story had such explicit mythological weight, created an unusual dynamic at the game's most serious moments. Standing before Cyrus at Spearpillar, the player character was witnessing events of cosmic significance while maintaining a silence that players projected whatever they brought to it. This silence was not absence but openness, a space that the player filled with their own relationship to what was happening. Professor Rowan's characterization established the academic tone of the region from the first encounter. His severity and his genuine investment in Pokémon research were present in equal measure, creating a mentor figure who was demanding because he took the subject seriously, rather than because he was indifferent to those he mentored. The early task of choosing a starter from his research case, and then being thrown immediately into the kind of situation he had sent the player out to observe, was typical of his approach to education through direct experience. The Galactic bomb plot against Lake Valor represented the story's escalation from organized crime to something approaching an act against nature itself. The explosion that Team Galactic triggered at the lake, draining it and leaving its resident guardian exposed and weakened, was among the more disturbing single events in the main series at that point. The visual of a drained lake, the water simply gone, the landscape changed by deliberate action, carried an environmental quality that the game did not minimize. Azelf's vulnerability after this event, encountering the weakened guardian in a space stripped of the water that had defined it, created an emotional response that the game's narrative relied on to convey the seriousness of Team Galactic's actions. Until that moment, the organization had been dangerous in abstract terms. After it, the danger was visible in a way that could not be reversed by the conclusion of the encounter. The decision to make the Lake Guardian encounters accessible after the story's resolution, even after Team Galactic had been defeated and the water restored, was one of those design choices that maintained internal consistency at the cost of emotional coherence. Players who had been present for the events of the story and then returned to the lakes to catch the Guardians encountered them in spaces that felt whole again, which was technically accurate, but emotionally slightly at odds with the weight of what had happened there. The mythology connected to all three lakes suggested that the Guardians had chosen their locations rather than simply inhabited them. The lakes were not their homes in the sense of habitats, but in the sense of stations, positions they had chosen to occupy, because the world they served required a distribution across the region. This quality of chosen responsibility, rather than simple residence, gave the lake encounters a different character from wild Pokémon encounters that simply placed creatures in plausible habitats. The Grand Underground expanded significantly in the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes, built on the original Underground system, in ways that revealed what the original design had gestured toward. The biomes within the underground space, distinct ecosystems accessible through different paths and tunnels, gave the subterranean world a complexity that matched the surface world's diversity without simply mirroring it. The original Underground's digging mechanic had a tactile quality that fit the nature of archaeological work. Players moved the stylus across the touchscreen to brush away material covering buried items, watching the shape of what was hidden become clearer as more material was removed. The risk of pressing too hard and cracking the wall created a tension that kept the process from being purely routine. Every dig was slightly different, the items different, the resistance of the material different, the proximity to the edges different. Spheres, the currency of the underground exchange economy, accumulated through digging and could be traded with underground traders for specific items, traps, or decorations for secret bases. The entire underground economy was self-contained, operating on resources that existed only within the underground space and serving needs that were specific to underground activities. A player could engage extensively with the underground systems without those engagements affecting the surface game, except through the items they chose to carry up. Secret bases in the underground could be decorated with statues that attracted specific Pokémon to the underground biomes in later versions, creating a direct connection between the player's curation of their personal space and the wildlife available in the shared underground world. This mechanic made the act of base decoration a contribution to the underground ecosystem rather than simply a personalization exercise. The Pokemon Amity concept, central to certain evolutions and to contest performance, was expressed most literally in the Amity Square in Heartham, but was present throughout the region in the friendship mechanics effects on battle and evolution. The idea that a Pokemon's emotional relationship with its trainer had mechanical consequences was not new to Sinnoh, but the region's mythology gave it a deeper context. If the Lake Guardians had created the human capacity for emotion, and if that capacity was fundamental to how humans related to the world, then the relationship between a trainer and their Pokemon was an expression of one of the most basic qualities of human existence. Friendship was not simply a game mechanic. It was, within the region's own mythology, the expression of what humans were made for. The mechanical consequences of friendship in battle, the critical hit rate, the survival of lethal damage, the higher contest performance, were expressions of something the world's deepest mythology had established as genuinely foundational. The high friendship evolutions in Sinnoh, Togekiss from Togetic, Lucario from Riolu, Espeon and Umbreon in their time-dependent forms, all required not simply accumulated happiness, but the specific demonstration of friendship at particular moments. The time-dependent evolutions built trust into the actual passage of time, asking the player to maintain a relationship across the duration of a journey rather than simply accumulating points. This patience as prerequisite quality extended throughout Sinnoh's engagement with the relationship between trainer and Pokémon. The game was not simply asking players to use their Pokémon in battles and keep their health up. It was asking them to pay attention, to notice when things changed, to return and check on what they had left growing. The region's relationship with real time and with the mechanics of care created an experience of genuine tending rather than simple optimization. The distortion world's design drew from ideas in physics and mathematics about spaces where the usual rules of geometry did not apply. Non-Euclidean space, in which the relationships between distances and angles deviated from the familiar patterns of the physical world, was a concept that game design had approached in various ways, but rarely with the commitment that Sinnoh's distortion world demonstrated. Moving through the space required accepting that the next step might go in a direction that the previous step would not have predicted. Platforms existed in relationships to each other that changed based on which platform you stood on. Looking at the world from one position showed a configuration that looked different from another position, even when the physical distance between those positions was small. The space itself was unreliable in a way that rewarded the willingness to abandon assumptions and observe each situation fresh. Giratina's movement through this space was consistent with a creature that had been shaped by it over whatever span of time had passed since its banishment. Its origin form, available in the distortion world, moved through the space without the evident effort that the player character required. The creature was at home in a way that demonstrated the difference between a being native to a space and a visitor within it. The items found in the distortion world required navigating the space to reach, which meant that collecting everything it contained was an exercise in reorienting repeatedly and maintaining awareness of how far the exploration had gone and what remained. Players who tried to map the space in the conventional sense encountered the fundamental problem that the space did not conform to the conventions mapping relied on. Navigation required something more intuitive, more responsive to what the space was actually showing, rather than what a map said should be there. The relationship between Sinnoh's weather systems and the creatures that inhabited specific routes created an ecological consistency that rewarded attention to environmental conditions. Routes with persistent rain attracted different wild encounters than routes with clear skies. The hail conditions on northern routes affected which Pokémon were encountered and how those encounters proceeded. Weather was not simply an atmosphere, it was a selection pressure. The weather mechanic in battle had been part of the series since the second generation, but Sinnoh developed its relationship with weather summoning abilities and held items in ways that made weather a genuine strategic consideration rather than an occasional factor. The introduction of strong abilities that summoned weather conditions automatically, combined with held items that extended the duration of those conditions, made weather control a foundational element of certain team-building approaches. Abomasnow's ability to summon hail, Hippowdon's ability to summon sandstorm, Politoed and Pelipper for rain, Ninetales for sun, each representing a different meteorological condition with its own set of benefiting and suffering species, created a meta-level interaction between team compositions that made weather a category of strategic consideration as significant as type matchups for players engaged with competitive play. The in-game weather of specific routes and caves was fixed rather than strategic, but it created the ecological context that the battle mechanic needed to feel grounded. Players who understood weather as something the world contained encountered weather in battle as an extension of that understanding rather than a purely abstract mechanic. Sinnoh's attention to environmental consistency made the boundary between world design and battle system less distinct than it appeared in earlier entries. The Pokemon Research Laboratory at San Gem Town was a small building whose interior contained more information than its exterior suggested. Professor Rowan's work on Pokemon evolution was explicitly the focus of his research, which gave the entire Sinnoh journey a frame that players might not have initially applied to their experience. Every evolution they witnessed was within the story's logic, a data point in an ongoing scientific investigation. The relationship between Rowan's research and the player's journey was one of genuine collaboration, rather than the simple favor structure that some previous professor relationships had suggested. Rowan sent players into the field not because he needed a courier, but because direct observation was the only way to gather the kind of information his research required. The player's journey was the experiment, the Pokédex was the instrument, the region was the laboratory. This framing gave even the most routine encounters a quality of observation rather than simply acquisition. Seeing a new Pokemon, even if the player had no intention of catching it, contributed to the regional record that the Pokédex was assembling. The data collected through ordinary movement through the world was genuinely valuable to the framework the game established for why the journey was happening. The tradition of the professor sending a young trainer into the world with a starter Pokemon and a Pokédex had been part of the series since its beginning, but Rowan's formality and the explicit research context he established made it feel less like a tradition being followed and more like a genuine choice made by a specific person for specific reasons. The opening of Sinnoh, with Rowan's interrupted lecture and the sudden encounter with wild Pokemon, demonstrated the research context in practice before it was explained in theory. The evolution of Eevee into its multiple forms was handled in Sinnoh with particular care because several new evolutions were introduced alongside the existing ones. Leafeon's connection to a specific moss-covered rock in Eterna Forest required knowing the rock existed and knowing that proximity to it was the relevant condition. There was no item to obtain, no level threshold to reach. The rock was simply there, and if Eevee was there with it, with sufficient friendship, or at the appropriate level depending on the version, transformation was possible. Glaceon's equivalent was an ice-coated rock near the entrance to the snowfield routes. The symmetry between a grass evolution connected to ancient moss and an ice evolution connected to ancient ice was deliberate, and the paired placement of these two evolutionary catalysts within the region created a hunt for those seeking both that took them across the full range of Sinnoh's environments, from forest to snowfield. Eevee's fundamental nature, an unstable genetic structure capable of multiple developmental directions, was one of the series' most durable design ideas. Each generation that expanded the evolution options was making a statement about the range of possible directions that a single foundational form could develop into. Sinnoh's additions of the grass and ice directions, the first new evolutions since the second generation, felt like a long-anticipated expansion of an incomplete set rather than an arbitrary addition. The existing evolutions available in Sinnoh through various means gave players who wanted to assemble a team built around the concept the full range available at that point in the series. The variety of types represented normal, fire, water, electric, psychic, dark, grass, ice, meant that an Eevee-only team could cover a remarkable range of matchups, a strategic consideration that dedicated players explored extensively. The quality of Sinnoh's Pokédex entries, the brief texts that appeared when a Pokemon's data was registered, maintained a range of tones that reflected the variety of creatures they described. Some entries were clinical, recording size, weight, and behavioral observations in language that felt like a field researcher's notes. Others were mythological, describing beliefs held about a creature rather than directly observable facts. Still others were quietly unsettling, describing behaviors or qualities that sat slightly outside what a natural history document would typically contain. The entries for ghost-type Pokémon in Sinnoh often occupied that third category. The description of Dusk Noir as a being that received transmissions from the ghost world on its antenna, telling it to whom to open its stomach door, was one of those entries that players found themselves rereading. The matter-of-fact delivery of information that would be disturbing in any other context was a quality that ghost-type entries exploited effectively. The entries for mythological Pokémon maintained a tone that reflected their status. Arceus's entries described a being that had shaped everything from chaos and was now considered the closest thing to a god the world contained. This language was direct rather than hedging, stating explicitly what other mythological entries circled around. The region had built its creation story carefully enough that stating the conclusion plainly felt earned rather than grandiose. Entries for ordinary species kept their own kind of interest. The description of Bibarel as a tireless dam builder that frequently blocked waterways to human frustration created a picture of a world in which human and Pokémon activities intersected in practical and sometimes inconvenient ways. The mundane coexistence suggested by that kind of entry gave the region's ecosystem a lived quality that the cosmic mythology would not have provided on its own. The competitive legacy of the Sinnoh era extended beyond specific Pokémon and into the structural changes that the generation introduced. The physical and special split, which moved the classification of attacks from type-based to move-based, was a change that rewarded players who understood a Pokémon's full potential rather than simply its type. Pokémon that had been limited by the mismatch between their stat strengths and their type's attack category found new viability. Some Pokémon that had been powerful under the old system were affected in the opposite direction. The introduction of abilities, which had begun in the third generation, expanded significantly in Sinnoh with new abilities that created additional strategic layers. The abilities that changed weather conditions upon entry, that prevented certain types of moves from working, that doubled specific stats under certain conditions, all required opponents to account for not just what a Pokémon was, but what it was doing to the battle environment. The held item system, also established in earlier generations, reached a new level of strategic integration in Sinnoh's competitive scene. Items that extended weather, that amplified moves of specific types, that provided recovery under certain conditions, that protected against specific categories of attack, all interacted with the expanded ability system to create combinations that the competitive community spent years fully mapping. Garchamp's position in the competitive landscape of the era was defined by this convergence of attributes. Its speed was high enough to outrun most threats. Its attack stat was high enough to make most threats regret the encounter. Its typing left it with few weaknesses, and those weaknesses were coverable. Its move pool was wide enough to handle the range of scenarios competitive play required. The creature was not unbeatable, but overcoming it required preparation that other threats of the era did not. The bond phenomenon that would be more fully explored in later entries had its earliest expressions in how Sinnoh handled the relationship between trainer and Pokémon. The mechanical friendship system measured something that the game treated as genuinely real rather than simply a numerical threshold. The happiness variable tracked interactions, healing, walking together, the passage of time in the party. These were experiences that accumulated into a relationship rather than simply a score. The Pokémon that evolved through friendship were demonstrating something about their own nature by requiring that condition. A Riolu that evolved into Lucario when its trainer's attention and care had reached a sufficient level was expressing the idea that becoming what it could be required a relationship to make it possible. The potential was present from the beginning. The relationship was what called it forward. This theme, potential requiring relationship to be realized, ran through much of Sinnoh's design without being stated explicitly. The region's mythology described humans as having been created through a gift from Pokémon. The evolutionary mechanics suggested that Pokémon could become more through their connection with humans. The relationship was not one directional, and it was not simply instrumental. Both parties were, within the terms of the world's mythology, changed by the encounter with the other. The game expressed this through mechanics, because that was the language available to it. But players who engaged with those mechanics over the full course of a Sinnoh journey often described something that felt less like operating systems and more like spending time with creatures who responded to how they were treated. Whether that quality existed in the mechanics or in the interpretation the player brought to them was a question the game never needed to answer. The experience of it was sufficient. As the snow continued to fall somewhere on a mountain at the center of everything, and the lakes held their silence, and the library kept its books open to anyone willing to read them, the world of Sinnoh continued in the patient way of places that have existed long enough to know that every visitor eventually comes to rest within them. The mysteries remain. The questions stay open. And somewhere between the first step onto Route 201 and the last look back from the other side of the mountain, something was understood that could not quite be put into words, which was exactly how Sinnoh intended it.